All right. And we are live. Happy days. How are you all getting on? Good to see you in the chat there. I see some familiar faces. I see Guy. I see Bubble Boy. This is a fake name. Brilliant. Nash Khalees, Falcon General.
Bubble Boy.
Bubble Boy. How are you getting on? Good to see you. Hope you are all doing well. Today we have One Dime with us. Going to have an interesting conversation. People are probably scared seeing accelerationism in the name and a very doomsday like thumbnail for this. Kind of playing on like the popular conception of, or I suppose misconception of what accelerationism is. And we're going to dive into that. We're going to have some fun. We're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about left accelerationism and Marxism. And I think it's going to be really interesting and fun conversation. If you haven't already, please subscribe to One Dime's channel. It's excellent. He makes really high quality videos. A great one on Warren Buffett recently and his kind of maybe pseudo-socialism, if you want to call it that. And just super high quality. This man is a master of, I think, Premiere Pro and Adobe After Effects. So yeah, definitely go
Thank you.
subscribe. Go subscribe for some good, solid Marxist content. Comrade, would you like to introduce yourself? Tell people a little bit about your background, how you came to the left, a little bit about your channel, and all that good stuff.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a socialist slash communist YouTuber. I basically try to make what I would call, just because I'm talking to a left wing audience, is well, probably anyway, is like essentially leftist propaganda. And why I use the word propaganda is, like in the older sense, propaganda is neither a negative or positive term. It's just it's content with the goal of persuading people.
Mm.
Right, like every political movement has propaganda. So I look at kind of the videos I try to make is I try to really build a anti-capitalist sentiment. So I'd mainly sometimes I'll target right wingers, but it's mainly liberals and social democrats who I try to target, and to kind of get away from the idea that we can have like a middle between capitalism and socialism in the form of social democracy. And yeah, so I try to kind of really have a deep analysis, but at the same time focus a lot on the visuals, because I noticed there's a lot of ways in which people are persuaded. It's visuals are very powerful, music is powerful. I start off just making really casual, like, video essays, but then as I got into Premiere Pro, I really wanted to, I don't know, amp up my game. And yeah, I would say I like Adam Curtis films. I know the movie director Adam Curtis, but I really don't like his political ideology.
He's like a neocon, isn't
And
he?
I think he's some kind of apparently he's some sort of libertarian, but I see him
Mm.
really as just a social democrat centrist, if that makes sense.
Mm.
But I wanted to make films not like that per se, but kind of my own type of films like that, which kind of, yeah, can give people a bit of a shutter effect and come out of that with the obvious conclusion being some sort of socialism.
Mm. But I always found
Yes.
that with those films, to me, they felt like they had quite a left wing trajectory. I was really surprised that he would consider himself to be left wing after seeing them. There's like the Century of the Self and that. I was reminded when you were
Mhm.
talking about like propaganda, the whole thing about like Edward Bernays and that. Like he wrote that sort of original,
Yeah.
the original books on this. Evil bastard. And yeah, of
Yeah,
course. Then sorry, go
he
ahead.
tends to he does have like a critical trajectory, but what I've always found with Adam Curtis is that he has a very idealist lens. So if you see like the way he analyzes in Century of the Self, it's like Freud started these ideas, Edward Bernays started these ideas, and then this became an
Mm,
egotistical society. And it's a very questionable narrative. And he also kind of, yeah, he kind of blames that this for, I guess, what became a sort of nihilistic, narcissistic culture in the 80s, and why it became depoliticized. But I think there's many reasons behind that. I've always found that's another thing I try to do in my content, as I try to show the material aspect as well as the ideological aspect. Particularly the Democrats and billionaires video about kind of how Democrats have a role in kind of saving the billionaire class
mm,
in times of crisis and their long-term interests. So I kind of wanted to show that in terms of pure, like, the economics of it, because a lot of people look at the Democrats have slightly better ideas and the Republicans have worse ideas, and it's like, well, actually they don't really have ideas, they have roles, in a kind of overarching system, right?
Mm, mm. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Please, please, everybody in the chat, go ahead and check out One Dime's videos. They're absolutely fantastic. You can see the Adam curves coming through, and I think you'll really appreciate it from more of a left wing perspective. They've gotten more Marxist over the videos. That's what we'll say. They've gotten a lot
Yeah.
more explicitly Marxist, I think, as time's
Yeah.
gone on.
Yeah, well, it's because I draw upon a lot of areas of theory. I do like Marxism a lot, and probably my favorite political field when it comes to strictly political theory and economic theory. But when it comes to philosophy, I also draw on a lot of postmodern theory because I feel like that
Mm,
explains a lot of the very weird cultural changes we've seen in the last 50 years, especially in kind of a digital age. And yeah, I have a video about Jean Baudrillard and the Gulf War and kind of applying that to Call of Duty and how, the division between reality and unreality is not very clear. Yeah, so, but I do kind of try to tie it to capitalism a lot in a lot of my content, but it did become more explicitly Marxist just because I still would sometimes get comments saying, like that they were saying, oh, do you think we should have a system like Denmark and Sweden? And I'm like, okay, I guess they still haven't got the point yet.
It's time to be a little bit more explicit. Yeah, I do sometimes question a lot of the kind of characters coming out of the kind of postmodern tradition. They kind of get away from like the old terminology because it's kind of just it's so tired in many ways for the mainstream audiences. Even talking about things like socialism or communism, it'll often be, rather than talking about that, they'll talk about like post-capitalism and things like that. And I'm always kind of like scratching my head like when they say like post-capitalism, because on
Oh,
one
I use that term sometimes. I
see,
use that with like people who are really like, I don't use that in my videos that much, but
mm,
with people who, it depends really how far on the line they are. If they're like a conservative or a person who's like really brainwashed, I'll use the word post-capitalism. But
mm.
then once the person becomes actually open to post-capitalism, they look into that, they start seeing that, well, I mean,
What
there's
is
not many
post-cap?
options.
Yeah. You either go back to
So
feudalism
it's
or you
like,
go
I feel
forward
like,
to
yeah,
socialism.
yeah, exactly. Like it's not third positionism, right? Or monarchism, because apparently that's a thing.
Yeah,
So,
unfortunately, Irish people know that all too well. It's just peeking at us from across the river in England. But yeah, but yeah, it
but
is
yeah,
interesting.
what you were saying regarding postmodern theorists, though, is some of them were Marxists and some kind of abandoned it. Like
Mm,
Baudrillard, who came out of the 80s and he saw the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of Yugoslavia, and the embrace of neoliberalism. And he kind of just saw we're entering like this dark age where you cannot really distinguish reality and fiction at all. And he lost hope in a lot of Marxism. You also had theorists like Jean-Francois Lyotard, who kind of also abandoned Marxism, and Foucault. Um, Although he supported the Maoists, weirdly enough, but he wasn't Marxist. Apparently, he actually wanted to hit on a lot of Arab men. Apparently,
huh.
he would like to go to Marxist protests for that. But that's apparently. I don't know
That's the
that for
reason
sure.
why.
I heard,
That's hilarious.
but there are some
Marxism for the babes.
there is some postmodernish Marxists. Like there's
Kind of like
Frederick
post-Marxists.
Jameson.
Hmm.
Yeah, well, there's like Frederick Jameson. He's quite explicitly a Marxist, but he has a postmodern analysis of society, but a Marxist solution.
Hmm.
That's kind of a little bit where I align. And Mark Fisher is a little bit like that. Theorists like Mark Fisher is, in many ways, Deleuze and Guattari are also, people question their Marxism a lot, but they identified as Marxism up till their death. So yeah, but I would say some people, they always say, I like a Marxist analysis of society, but I don't agree with the solution. I think we should have something far more in the middle. For
Hmm.
me, it's kind of the opposite. I kind of see Marxism can't explain a lot of social changes in society and a lot of things, but I like the solution and it can explain some things. So I see it as a multifaceted analysis, if anything. But yeah, I think Marxists should embrace postmodern theory, or at least study it. They don't have to, reject meta narratives altogether or anything like that.
Hmm.
I actually see Marxism as a necessary meta narrative for politics.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Absolutely. Yeah, I studied a lot of it when I was maybe about 10 years ago. I was quite into it. When I was in college, I was really into it, and yeah, but after a while, it kind of lost its sheen for me a bit, and I just got straight into the Marxism, all about that materialism these days. But it is still interesting. It is still how can I say, stimulating, intellectually stimulating. I just unfortunately I haven't found any, like, I haven't found it particularly useful in terms of like real world applications, in terms of like organizing and actually getting things done kind of in the real world. I've struggled to find applications for a lot of it. Sometimes it kind of just felt like how can I say, meandering.
Skepticism.
There was a lot of skepticism in it, but it was a lot of the time it was kind of just meandering intellectualism that didn't really get us anywhere. A lot of very fancy words that didn't really actually advance the conditions of the proletariat in a meaningful, tangible way, and in many cases just end up reinforcing it. Like, for example, you have a lot of people, like, for example, like Judith Butler and stuff like that, who would be kind of loosely in this field.
Yeah. Well, she's not even a socialist.
Yeah, like a radical centrist,
Yeah, I think she supported Kamala Harris.
Yeah, that's right.
But like in the case of people like Foucault were definitely not capitalists. In the case of Deleuze and Guattari, were outright communists. I would say more so Guattari, because he was actually in the streets, like in protests, and he was a lot more serious. But I would say if there is any criticism of postmodernism, the biggest from the Marxist end is definitely that it's not a tendency or a broad field which has solutions. It's precisely the opposite. It's kind of tearing apart everything else. I would just say and I would say philosophy needed a lot of that. There was a lot of still remnants of liberal assumptions and Enlightenment assumptions that kind of flooded discourse, like overly humanistic assumptions of rationality, of morality. Even I would say there is some things in Marxism that I think taking a postmodern approach, you can be skeptical of, like the idea that communism/socialism is inevitable. I think that inevitability has kind of often led to kind of people being a little bit overly hopeful and not seeing what is actually happening. And I would say, as we get into it, if there's any criticism of maybe accelerationism, is this kind of these assumptions, right? Which I think accelerationism, both on the left and right side, are both heavily modernistic, hyper-modern in many ways tendencies. Whereas postmodernists is, I think postmodernists is not a political ideology. It's simply just questioning things, which I think can be healthy in many ways.
Definitely,
it helped me get out of liberalism. Postmodern theory is what helped me get out of liberalism.
Good. I'm glad that it was a good bridge for you towards socialism, and I hope more people can see it in that perspective. So brilliant, thank you very much. Let's jump into this. We'll take Q&As throughout this, but first we're just going to introduce the main sort of points of today's stream. Accelerationism, so let's talk a little bit about accelerationism. Maybe we'll have to start by debunking some of the myths about what acceleration is and what it is not. What is left accelerationism? What is right accelerationism? What are the popular understandings or misunderstandings of what accelerationism is? Would you like to take that away?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So I think accelerationism is very difficult to explain because it's kind of nebulous, and there's accelerationism of the 90s and accelerationism of now. But I would probably like to first off just like debunk exactly what it definitely is not. And there's this idea on the internet, and a lot of people assume this, that accelerationism is making the material conditions so bad that people revolt and have a revolution. And so on the right wing side, there is like this assumption, I guess, for among maybe some edgy people on the internet, that they just want to see everything collapse like Clown World. but like on the left, there's some people on the internet who believe this, but it's not an academic tendency whatsoever, that by making things worse, you'll have a revolution, because as if that's what made people revolt. Maybe in certain times in history, yes, you could say, for example, like the First World War and the Russian Revolution, or the Civil War and the Chinese Revolution. But in World War II and Chinese Revolution, but it's not really. We've seen a reduction in wages and exacerbated living conditions for people since the 1970s. Wages have been stagnant since then, and conditions have been getting objectively worse. And there's been multiple crises. I mean, we had 2 consecutive ones, like 2008, and now with the COVID crash. And if material conditions alone are what drove people to revolt, then we would have had a revolution in the West a long time ago. So that, first of all, it's not an assumption that any left-wing or accelerationist theorists have ever really said that to make things worse. In many ways, it's kind of the opposite. So we can get into that after, but yeah, like that's to dispel it, is just to like as if it's making things worse. Or voting for Trump, I've heard that before, as people say to vote for Trump is accelerationist because it'll revitalize the left, and that's just simply bullshit. Because making people's living conditions worse actually makes it, I would say in today's day and age, makes it harder, if anything, because it's harder to organize when you have less free time.
Yeah, 3 jobs.
It's actually
very difficult.
Yeah, it's such a risk. Like, okay, a perfect example is in Amazon, and for the Amazon unionization in Alabama, they voted no against it. And we can say like, all those people are stupid, and maybe ideology has a factor, but I think a big thing that has always plagued unionization is that people are just don't want to take the risk because they feel like they might lose their jobs, and rightfully so. So it's the idea that making people like starve and have terrible conditions will somehow lead to this glorious revolution is insane. And also, for the record, I don't think Trump revitalized the left at all. I think, if anything, he set discourse backward, because everyone was talking about social justice warriors instead of like, class issues, right? Like it was just like anti-SJW that was like YouTube for so long. And then BreadTube was the entirety of BreadTube for so long was just debunking right-wingers. So I think Trump and conservatives set discourse backwards. And now, granted, the change is not so much better under Biden, but I would say what really revitalized the left was, on one end, Bernie Sanders popularizing the term socialism so people can at least look at what it is. And also Bernie Sanders ultimately failing, I think, in 2016, especially, and 2020, it made people kind of question whether this electoral route is really possible. And I think there's possibility. Yeah, I think there's possibilities for like democratically elected soft socialists in some European countries. Portugal is a possibility, and there's possibilities in France, but I don't view America as a democracy in any sense. So I just don't think that's a possibility whatsoever in America. But yeah, so like this begs the question: what exactly is accelerationism? And another thing is so the easiest way to, I guess you could say, the less bad conception of accelerationism is that we must speed up the productive forces of capitalism, and that the only way out of capitalism is through capitalism. And we need to just accelerate that. But there's some misconceptions as to what these things mean. And then there's also just different interpretations. The misconception about that, I would say, is most certainly the idea that we can somehow actually change this. Like, there's no one at the steering wheel. We can't just go on the steering wheel and accelerate something like, ooh, push, and then just it takes off, like as if. And it's so being anti-accelerationist to me is a little bit ridiculous, because it's like nothing we can really do for that. I mean, it's happening. Accelerationist as a theoretical tendency is more so an observation. So it's an observation that what's happening is that capitalism is accelerating. All kind of terrible things are accelerating on one end, and mostly everything that's involving the acceleration of capitalism is pretty terrible. But there's some, I guess you could say, things that could be emancipatory. I wouldn't say that they are by design, but things like automation, for example, the evolution of the internet. There's a lot of things that are kind of byproducts of capitalism. In many ways, capitalism kind of merging with the state that could be used for leftist causes, but that's not a guarantee, right? And so what are like, okay, where does accelerationism as a theoretical tendency sort of derive from? Do you want me to go into the origins, or just quickly give examples as to who are like left-wing accelerationist people should check out?
It might not be a bad idea to just give like a quick overview of the origins and just take us through that and then give some examples afterwards.
Okay,
If that's
so
okay with you.
yeah. So this will be a summary, but so okay, it really started off in the 1990s with a group called the CCRU, something Cybernetic Research Unit, and it comprised of the theorist Nick Land, Mark Fisher, who was a student, Alex Williams, I believe, was part of that group, and then Sadie Plant, what's his name, Robin McKay, and a couple of theorists there. And it really was a product, in my opinion, of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism was sort of like there was no alternative. That's what people thought, and it was the fall of the Soviet Union. And I can't think of any worse time in modern history, anyway, that to be a leftist than the 1990s. It's just impossible. Like, you can even be a social democrat.
So bleak.
Yeah, it's yeah, terrible decades. So it kind of even pushed a lot of leftists to think in many different ways. So I would say what emerged in the 1990s was a more ridiculous idea of accelerationism, which did not pan out. And then you kind of got something that I think is more sophisticated that emerged more this decade. So, okay, you had people like Nick Land, who was originally a leftist, who saw that the only option is to accelerate capitalism. And there's people on the left who thought this too. And granted, they were taking a lot of speed. And you can kind of see that in the writings. Like, they're they're taking a lot of speed. So maybe that had to do with the accelerationist aspect. Yeah. I mean, there's all kind of hilarious stories about like they would just listen to jungle music and like do like little raves, then like read theory, and then come up with ideas. But yeah, so what you had, so what happened then? So then in the 2000s, throughout the 2000s, they came to a kind of daunting realization. The future is very fucking boring. You did not have this AI, cybernetic surgeons. You had internet companies, yes, but like the top performing companies, at least in the United States, were like Domino's Pizza and oil companies like Chevron. So you didn't have like all this innovation. So this led a lot of the theorists. Now, granted, you started to have the development of AI, but I would say it's much more accelerated in the 2010s than this decade. Like the Bush era was a terrible era, absolute most boring era of capitalism ever. And you had these theorists come to different conclusions. So on Nick Land's side, this is when Nick Land, some say it's maybe because he overdosed a little bit too much on the speed and fried his brain. Some people say that anyway, but he went really hard right, and not right wing in the sense we might think, but he wanted to see what is the problem. Why aren't we getting at least some positives out of this capitalism? And instead of turning to Marx, which I will go on later to show, like that was actually what you can find an easy reason for this when looking at like through a Marxist lens, but I would say Nick Land looked at this more through the Edmund Burke kind of lens, a statist lens. And he saw China, Singapore, countries which were growing rapidly and kind of building more futuristic projects, and that their infrastructure was much better. Whereas like America's infrastructure looks like Baghdad. And so you had this, what Nick Land looked at that and he thought, well, the problem is because of we don't have enough government intervention. You have in China the sort of unification of the state and capital, the state basically directing capital, and they can, by doing so, direct innovation. And they also kind of, China in many ways knew that like capitalism's most interesting aspects can also be its worst. So there was like a lot of exploitation in the Deng era, but also a lot of explosive innovation. You had this also in Singapore, a very statist capitalist system. But this is not the only place you had innovation. You had innovation in Germany, then later in the United States, especially in the 2010s when it comes to a lot of interesting AI and 3D printing. But okay, now what did the left accelerationists think? And this is where I think the approach is much more interesting. So you have people like Mark Fisher, who has his Terminator versus Avatar essay, if people want to check that out. But I think the Alex Williams and Nick Cernacek was not affiliated with the CCRU, but he's someone who's often thrown into the left accelerationist category, they have interesting insights. So they had a simple explanation for why this explosive innovation didn't really pan out as nicely as people predicted, and that was simply wages are too damn low. So there's no incentive for companies to actually start embracing automation, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, or 3D printing, because it's just so much cheaper to employ people for nothing. And even more so, the rise of free trade and all these free trade agreements, which allowed people to sort of utilize cheap labor without tariffs, of course, in China, Bangladesh, various countries, Malaysia. And yeah, it was a way, like, why would a lot of companies want to embrace automation or things like 3D printing and invest their money in it? Because this is an investment. It's not for free, obviously. When they can just employ people for nothing. And this is the horror of neoliberalism. In my opinion, neoliberalism is not accelerationist in a positive sense. Anyway, it is in negative ways, right? But there's nothing. I don't think there's really anything emancipatory about neoliberalism. You have without higher wages, there's not an incentive, but you do start to get an incentive when costs build up. So now, what is the vision that people like Alex Williams and Nick Cernacek kind of illustrate? Well, there's the one you took a look at, which is the Accelerationist Manifesto, which there's a podcast, if you want to link it in the chat, which I think the host from Red Left Radio, Brett O'Shea, was on it, and they discussed it. But I actually think the book that really outlines what I find to be more interesting ideas was the book it's also by Nick Cernacek and Alex Williams, called Inventing the Future, Post-Capitalism and a World Without Work. And they kind of make the case that, okay, for left-wing strategy, there's a lot of things that are kind of sort of becoming out of date. Now, a working class, of course, exists, and if anything, is more precarious in many places of the world. But they kind of want to do away with terms like the proletariat, and they don't think that simply having the working class seize ownership of the state and the means of production is really enough to rally people for a leftist movement. So they propose a kind of post-work movement. Now, that doesn't mean the abolishment of work. There's some people who always react to this and think, oh, well, like, what are people going to do? They're just going to, like, lie around like sloths, or like, I mean, it's not. I think the idea that there's a dichotomy between work and leisure, that divisive, is more of a product of our ideology, because what it's more so is to reduce working time dramatically, and so that people don't need they don't need to work to survive. So you shouldn't have to work just to get free housing, enough basic income to live, and education and healthcare. Those are things that once you have those, you solve a lot of problems. But they're not under any delusion that capitalism is just going to give people things. This is something you have to really struggle and fight for. And that's what they argue. And you don't get they are critical of a lot of different leftist movements, like they're heavy critical of anarchists and kind of primitivist tendencies which try to escape capitalism inadvertently through, like, autonomous zones and kind of and all that stuff. And also they're skeptical of people just want to tame capitalism as an end in itself. They don't really say that they're opposed to smashing capitalism. They just don't think it's possible. So that's something to really take into consideration with the left accelerationist views. It's not that socialism is necessarily a bad idea. is that they don't think it's possible. They don't think revolution is possible, at least in the Western world, like countries like America, the UK, because this class consciousness. I'm sure we'll get into that later, but they think that like a way just to actually get people to support a leftist movement is to kind of like significantly less and having more free time.
Ooh, it's cutting
We'll
out
throw out there.
slightly. Yeah, it just went out slightly there. I'm not sure. Maybe there's an
Oh,
internet issue. Just cut out slightly there. We missed a little bit of what
do
you
you
just
hear me
said.
now?
I can hear you now perfectly. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Where did it cut off exactly?
It was kind of going in and out. My mind blanks
Oh, shite.
anytime this. Anytime this
Okay.
happens.
Well, I'll say. Okay, so basically, they view revolution as sort of an impossibility in most Western countries. And because simply class consciousness isn't there and the repressive military. But mainly, okay, so the class consciousness aspect is you need to build a leftist movement, and they compare a little bit of how neoliberalism came into fruition. Is neoliberalism, despite ultimately benefiting the capitalist class, was not the state ideology, and it was actually very fringe for a long time. And they had to build organizations, do a lot of propaganda, go on TV networks, and also kind of make all these kind of infiltrate academia and also spread all their articles everywhere. There's tons of think tanks. They had to do this to kind of manufacture consent for what was the neoliberal agenda. And let's think about that. And for the left, we need to do 10 times that. The goal of the left is much more difficult. We're not in a state really where people are blank slates. We're not just, the working class isn't necessarily going to support socialism or a socialist movement just because it benefits their interests. There has to be a lot of reason for them to support it. A lot of people, obviously vote contrary to their class interests, as we saw with Boris Johnson actually won over more working class people than Corbyn.
Wow.
Which should be a shocker.
Jesus.
Yeah, and I think Biden might have won more working class people than Bernie Sanders, which is insane. And so it's crazy. Like there's a lot of work to do, and I think there's just too much of this idea that socialism is when the government does stuff, or like that socialism is just big government tyranny. And while for many people we can kind of explain that, no, like actually the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is a term I never like to use, by the way, it's too scary. But like what that really just but it's like what it is obviously is just, it's the working class kind of being in control of the state, and that implies right now we have the capitalists indirectly in control of the state. But it's just not something that is a purely rallying point. Whether we do that in practice, that's a matter of debate. I think that what we actually implement in socialism is a whole nother topic, to which I'm a lot more sympathetic to kind of really actually Marxist solutions, a lot of Paul Cockshot's ideas particularly. But as a pure strategy, I think the reduction of the working day is something that kind of changes discourse a little bit. And it's something a lot of people can kind of get behind. You can kind of spread that argument in many ways. So, but how do you get there? Okay, so for the left accelerationists like Cernicek, they propose that you cannot have lower wages. So okay, they're really critical of trade unionists that only demand jobs. So the goal of trade unionists should be obviously to demand higher wages, but often what it's devolved into is just give us work. At least that's how the unions in Canada are, and I've heard in many other places. It's really sad. But there needs to be actually a demanding of higher wages, and also we need to kind of need to see automation as an inevitability, because I don't think we can really be anti-automation, because they're going to do it. Bigger corporations are going to do it, but it's just going to be very slow, gradual bleed. When I think we should be preparing for solutions of a automated world. Not everything will ever be automated, of course, but like approximately, as a statistic, it was between 48% and 69% in the next 2 decades of jobs can be automated. Wow. And we've already seen a lot of automation already happening. And okay, I'll give an example just where I live in Canada. There's already a crisis of work, to the point where the government literally creates bullshit jobs out of nowhere. Like there's the biggest employer in Canada, I think, or no, it's the third biggest employer is the state. And a lot of it is agencies, which are just PR agencies, or agencies that are like human resources that are for departments that don't really need to be there. It's a whole meme that, you know, the government jobs, whatever, pointless. But they're creating that just because there's not enough to go around. And I think we should be looking at, okay, we should have people able to work substantially less and be guaranteed certain means of survival. And as well, like you would have a society in which people more take turns to work instead of simply not work at all. But we would have overall people work less and not have to work to, you know, merely survive. I think it's no society should have that to, you know, work paycheck to paycheck just to like literally live. It's an embarrassment, especially in developed countries that already are getting the capacity to do that. So essentially what these left accelerationists are proposing is something like a fully automated luxury communism, but more realistic. So like I would say partially automated communism, but it's like a gradual road, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And there's some problems which we can get into later, because I think there's I think, you know, you'll have conflicts and contradictions with the capitalist class perhaps fighting back. And, you know, we need to maybe look at, you know, some Marxist, perhaps Leninist perspectives, perhaps Maoist perspectives of kind of, you know, how to fight back against that. But that's for another topic.
Yeah, we'll have to return to that a few stages later. Yeah, brilliant. Just for the comrades in the chat there who are asking questions, I've written them down. I'm writing them down on a little doc at the moment, on a Word document at the moment. So we'll come to those as we push through them. There's so much stuff that you said there, and there's so many like interesting points that I was thinking of as you were speaking. I did think it was really interesting that you said that, and with a lot of these left accelerationists, they just kind of, in many ways, don't really think it's possible to, you know, smash the state for the proletariat to like take power, and, you know, like the old kind of the classic kind of Leninist line of bringing about socialism through the dictatorship, proletariat, and so on and so forth. And I think we saw that as well. I think we saw that with the people who wrote that Acceleration manifesto. They were kind of working on the Corbyn campaign in the UK, and so it was quite you know, democratic socialist or social democratic oriented in that kind of sense. And you know, you can see that playing out. You know, it's maybe not about, you know, taking up arms to literally overthrow the bourgeoisie at gunpoint or anything like that. You know, it's kind of a little bit more humble in outlook in many ways, and I think that's an interesting point. And I also
think this.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just real quick, but I think that their vision of a trajectory is more or less kind of like a Salvador Allende type of democratic socialism as a bridge to what would later be communism. So it's sort of like a bridge. It's not an end in itself. They're actually very critical of social democracy as an end in itself, but that's sort of like a bridge.
So like an actual democratic socialism rather than the...
Yeah, but obvious, yeah, like Salvador Allende was a real socialist, but we can see how there was problems with that in the sense that I mean, he got killed.
Yeah,
they got overthrown.
Didn't work.
So like there's always that possibility, which is why I think we, maybe not with the normies who are new to, like, you know, talk about armed revolution, but I think among leftist circles that should be a real debate, because you know, like I think it's a real possibility in the future where you'll have people like Bezos, Zuckerberg, you know, having the private armies and stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's so like for sure, like we can't. It's ridiculous to think we can, you know, cross out the idea of revolution entirely, because that's really important. But as a pure discourse, I think that's what they're more suggesting as a discourse. So like something kind of as like a post-work discourse. And I think it would be interesting to see like a democratic socialist attempt as like a sort of backup plan. As if that doesn't work out, for like revolution would be very justified, I think, among the, granted, okay, it really depends on how, you know, class conscious people are by this time, but I think people would be much more likely to support a revolution if they saw before their eyes like democracy just not working.
Well, it's an interesting one, because we have seen democratic socialists and social democrats and some like who kind of are sort of in the middle there, kind of like sort of treading the line between social democrats and democratic socialists. Like Corbyn would be an example of that, you know. But we've seen characters like that all over the world, and you know, for example, like Lula and the Workers' Party in Brazil would be a pretty solid example of that. And you know, they got into power like in the, I think it was maybe 2004, around about 2004. And in the first 4 years that they were in power, they made a ton of progressive achievements. They lifted hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty. They opened up like many different like educational institutions. They brought in like a sort of a universal, not like a universal basic income, but basically like an unemployment thing. It's called like Bolsa Familia, and it was basically just like money for the people. And like the achievements they made in Brazil at that point were kind of the achievements that you see in a revolutionary situation. Like they were really amazing. Then
And they
this,
also accelerated the forces of capitalism too. Like they
yeah,
became
that's right.
industrialized, which is very important, right? Because like Brazil, I don't think really could. They were like much more underdeveloped before Lula, right? But yeah,
They
yeah,
definitely did develop. Yeah, that's right. That's right. They did. The second PT term, things weren't quite as good. The second 4 year term, things didn't go so well. And actually, this experiment with social democracy or democratic socialism actually turns them back. You know, because this was kind of riding the pink wave, the pink wave in Latin America, and that turned a lot of people back towards the right and the hard right. So now you literally have the fascist Bolsonaro in power, and so. I would
Well,
like that to work, but I'm not sure if the historical
well,
experience bears it out. You know.
to one detail there though is that before Dilma was impeached, there was a
Yeah.
centrist party that was kind of took power, and then people got pissed off, and then you had Bolsonaro come to power. But yeah, for the record, Lula would I don't think ever described himself as a socialist, even though he was when he was young.
When he was
But
younger,
his
he was very
party,
explicitly anti-capitalist
yeah, he
in
was a
his first few
guerrilla,
terms.
wasn't he?
Yeah, Dilma was definitely a guerrilla. I don't know if Lula was involved. I know he was more of a union guy. He was a militant kind of union guy, like really active in the trade union movement. And then in his the first few times he was running for president, he was like talking about this inhumane system, about smashing capitalism. Like he was very explicitly anti-capitalist. The organization then was very much socialist oriented. PT was very much socialist oriented, but it moved much more towards the center as time went on. By the time he got into
I think
power,
it's because
he had dropped socialism. Like he just kind of abandoned the term, and it was very much social democracy.
well, could that just be because of all of what he had seen with all the other experiments in South America just getting slaughtered by America?
Maybe, yeah, it's very
Now, I
possible.
think that's kind of I think even if it's like yeah, so a democratic socialism or if it's a revolutionary socialism in most parts of the world will get totally crushed by the United States, which is why I see for socialism to happen it has to be international, which I guess you could say is I don't really call myself a Trotskyist because there's many problems there, like I that's one Trotskyist idea that I definitely agree with is that I think at this stage of globalization you need international revolution, and I think what's most important is that you
Unless you
need
got nukes. If you got nukes, small country nukes, nobody's gonna fuck with you.
or it could just become a Poseidist dystopia where everyone just kills each other.
Where the dolphins at? Yeah.
but I think so. I think really for socialism to be implemented anywhere, it has to be implemented in the places where capitalism began. So the UK, Germany, France, America, most importantly, because while I think there's places in Europe who could maybe get away with a kind of democratic socialism and not get destroyed, but just because of where they're located possibly in Europe. But I think most places, America has military bases everywhere, democratic or not, they'll just try to destroy it.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I really see America as an important turning point, especially England, because I kind of have my doubts that if England went socialist, that America would squash it. In Canada, it's a very big possibility that they would if Canada went socialist, that America would quash it because we're right at the border and we're also like a non-existent military. So, but yeah, I do see that as important. So like, there is a Maoist viewpoint of third worldism that revolutions can't take place anywhere except the third world. And I see their point in that there isn't like a peasantry in the developed countries. But the problem is that it'll just be so easily squashed. That's how I see it. Or it'll be like a long, bloody battle. in which like some of the few examples of countries that have socialist systems that have successfully sustained themselves, like Vietnam, were with a lot of casualties, and of course they have their certain conditions, right, which kind of benefit them, their jungles. But I think it's a really tough struggle, and why I do see the West is I don't like to use the word the West, but advanced industrial capitalist countries like America, Canada, England, those countries are really focal points. I would say China too. Now, some people,
People
let's not get into that debate.
Get cancelled.
Yeah, 'cause people try to cancel you over that, but
oh no, the PTSD is kicking in now.
yeah.
But yeah, that's a very controversial thing to say with MLs. But for anyone else, like any other part of the political spectrum, people are just like, yeah, of course.
Well, I mean, I'll say for the record, if it was just China doing capitalism, I wouldn't say that they're not socialist. Like Vietnam does capitalism, and Cuba did like some aspects, some market reforms. And I still think they're like ultimately socialist states. But the difference is I just don't see in China that the working class control the state, because they have billionaires in their party, a lot of them.
Oh yeah. Whereas Jack Ma,
I don't believe that's billion. I don't. Yeah,
net worth.
I don't believe. Yeah, it's just so ridiculous to think that because like in the case of the USSR, they had the new economic plan. Like it's not for countries that are essentially behind in development. It's needed to have capitalistic reforms. Arguably, at least that's a justification. But that makes sense. I wouldn't object to that. It's really just like who's in control of the state, and also kind of, as you and Premier Lies analyzed pretty well, is that there's
there is
questionable. Yeah. Let's not get into that.
Yeah, I think we'll leave it at that before we get like ultra cancelled again. Revived and then cancelled again. One other thing that struck me when you were talking was about neoliberalism, and how you said that neoliberalism wasn't accelerationist. It wasn't actually helping to advance things. And what strikes me as quite interesting about that is that neoliberalism is, in a sense, developing some productive forces, but it doesn't change the relations of production, which is really important, because there is this dialect. When we talk about modes of production, there's a dialectical unity between the relations of production and the productive forces. And without changing those relations of production, it's not actually going to benefit the workers. It's not actually going to benefit the people, And so we see this breakdown of conditions for the workers. We see people talk about this new grouping, the precariat. I actually just see the precariat as a rolling back to sort of like earlier conditions for the proletariat, but some people see it as like a different grouping. But this whole rise of like the gig economy, delivery workers, no stability of the workplace, these are huge problems. It's a nightmare for organizing. It's hell for organizing. Yeah. You talked about automation as well. I thought that was really interesting. You go into a McDonald's now, and rather than seeing like a person standing at a till, like you've just got a bunch of these like little machines that you put in your order to now as well, and each one of those represents a lost job. A job that's been automated away. Which, if the working class was in charge, if the working class was in control, if the relations of production have been changed, that could be beneficial to everybody. Everybody could be enjoying this advancement in technology. Everybody could be enjoying this acceleration. But we can't, because we haven't changed the relations of production. That's where my whole vision of socialism, then communism, kind of goes. Is I'm not anti-technology. I think it's really reactive to go the anarchist approach or the reactionary approach of, which I'm not saying anarchists are reactionary, but I'm saying that like the reactionary but even like I noticed it's a sentiment in a lot of anarchist circles where it's kind of because it derives also from the desire to want communism without a transition or without a state transition, and I'm really skeptical of that. Like I don't think we can just bypass technology, because we either I think the working class just needs to seize the technology and use it to their benefit, or else it'll be used against them. It'll be used to oppress them. So I see those as the only options. I don't think we can just be like, oh, I'm not technology. Okay, I'll build my communes outside of capitalism. That's maybe interesting projects, and I think there are. I applaud the accomplishments of Rojava, but it doesn't like challenge capitalism. So that's how I view it. Is I think, like automation, we shouldn't just be mad at the technology. We should be mad at the capitalists
And automation could lead to a much more liberatory society. And I truly think if the USSR was still like thriving today, they would be pro automation.
Oh yeah,
And
definitely.
and because they had a vision of abundance. I mean, even in sort of what people might call the revisionist era, and Khrushchev was still there. They were still kind of, they had this idea of like whatever, like space communism and whatnot. But it sounds kind of ridiculous because of the meme. But I mean, I think the goal of socialism long term, you could call it communism, but it could start to happen in the transition of socialism, is a gigantic reduction in working. And perhaps even a reduction in working before socialism and a social democracy could help us actually achieve socialism, because then you actually have time for people to organize. That's why I am pro UBI, is that I think you need people to actually have time to organize and have time to actually, for people to, build some class consciousness. Because a large, like a simple reason, just like why people don't know about anything and only participate in politics like once every 4 years, is just there's no time, right? And it's a risk to organize too. So I do see as like I think it's inevitable that you'll start to have a very dispossessed labor class, but it'll be accelerated in a more positive way under social democracy, because at least the working class will get compensated in the kind of UBI, however abundant that is. I'm kind of skeptical as to how generous that would be, but it's better than nothing under neoliberalism, right? Like under this hellscape we're in, where it's impossible to organize. People are paid bare minimum wages, and you have to compete with other workers to get a job. It's the worst scenario imaginable for change, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope it would work. I hope things would get better, and there would be space to organize under some kind of social democracy. I'm skeptical. I don't know if this is the way forward to socialism, to communism, but it will be nice. I did notice there was a question in the live chat. Someone was saying that they still didn't really grasp what accelerationism actually is, so they were just struggling a little bit more from that. I just want to read out the little quote from the Communist Manifesto that this really derives from. It's chapter 2 of the Communist Manifesto. So it's the middle of chapter 2, and it says that the proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e., or in other words, of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase total productive forces as rapidly as possible. So that last part there, to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. And that's why I kind of have maybe touched on this a couple of times, where I kind of see this as quite similar in some ways to this kind of like theory of the productive forces, which I see popping up.
It is,
time and time again. Although I will say that the accelerationists do seem to at least say that it needs to be the working class. Like following on from this quote, they're saying that it's not just like under capitalism we can just develop these things. We actually need to have the working class in power. We need to have the oppressed class in power, for this to actually benefit people. We're talking a little bit about neoliberalism and how the development of technology and automation doesn't actually benefit people, while the ruling class, while the capitalist class are in charge. So this seems to at least kind of deal with that. It seems to at least acknowledge that we need to change the relations of production if we want to continue to advance the productive forces. But that seems to be it. I mean, for me, when I try to understand accelerationism or left accelerationism, it seems to be unleashing the productive forces. It seems to be this idea that the productive forces are kind of restrained and constrained by capitalism as it is right now, and neoliberal capitalism. And if we put the working class in power, then we can actually develop that and I suppose arrive at a society of abundance much more quickly and much more efficiently through that kind of method. That's kind of how I conceive of it anyway.
Well, it would certainly be better if the working class were leading the charge, right? But we're not in the steering wheel, and to get there, it's a very difficult task. And I think there is that kind of latent assumption in the accelerationist thinkers that, at least in the countries where the productive forces are the most advanced and accelerating, the probability of revolution right now, anyway, is very slim. So I think they see it as, okay, well, the best we can do is kind of get a party in power, like let's say social democracy, that will accelerate these productive forces. And as class consciousness builds and as people have more free time to organize and kind of build revolutionary movements, then you can kind of They leave it up in the air. I think they're also trying to show this to a wide audience, so they want to say like, "Oh, we're going to overthrow the bourgeoisie and like whatever." 'Cause that's like a way to I don't know, like that does kind of scare off some people, but I think that is a kind of high probability in the future, is that you will, as people get more free time, there's more dispossessed labor class, and as people are given the minimums to survive, which should be fought for, because the capitalist state is not going to give people things without really a lot of pushback. There's going to have to be a lot. That's why the political struggle is very important for the left accelerationists, whereas the other more nihilistic ones more or less abandon politics. But yeah, it would certainly be better if the working class were in charge. But I mean, it's not the case, right? But I think there's an important thing with Marx there too, is like, I think the productive forces is really important, because Marx, right, when he didn't think that, when he was looking at where socialism would even be possible, was looking at England and Germany, and then kind of started to look at the United States when he saw, when he actually admired Abraham Lincoln in a weird way, like not like he was some sort of socialist, but he kind of like saw him as sort of progressive in many ways, and he kind of was. I mean, he also killed a lot of indigenous people, but
super racist.
Yeah,
I don't think so.
But Marx was not under the delusion that anybody could just go straight to socialism. And I think there's a quote in the German Ideology somewhere where he says that countries without the productive forces will result in shared scarcity. So like, that's kind of why you need to develop that. That's why you can't just go straight to communism. And I think I have some criticisms a little bit of Mao's China in this regard, is that I felt like it was too fast. And I think like Lenin was right to implement the economic plan. And if anything, it should have probably been longer. Stalin probably should have waited before collectivization, I think, anyway. Because you have to be fairly advanced to have a surplus. You have to be very advanced. It takes a long time to have an abundance. But luckily, okay, now we have technologies that people back then could not even imagine. 3D printing can create stuff at a rapid pace with zero marginal cost, which is incredible. Like the people, I would encourage to look into these technologies specifically, like 3D printing, automation. I would say AI automation and machine learning, because machine learning is a specific type of AI that kind of trains itself how to do things. Type of technology. These things are really huge just for accelerating the productive forces, because we can provide abundance far easier. But I mean, well, in many countries like the United States, you can certainly provide an abundance now. But it would be, I think, in the future, in which people have more control over these aspects of production, it'll be much more effective. But now, okay, there's some ambiguity with Marx, because I know, if you notice in that Accelerationist manifesto, they include the Marx essay in the Grundrisse called, oh Jesus, it just slipped my mind. What's it called? A Fragment of Machines, right? And Fragment of Machines, he kind of he analyzes capitalism's tendency to increase productivity so much to produce as much with as little labor costs as possible, and how this might in the future squeeze out humans entirely of the productive process. And then as you adopt more technologies, and as there's mechanisms to improve productivity, like humans might just be lost in many aspects. And that's what we see with automation, right? Is there's more incentives to adopt automation. Companies will certainly do it. But right now you see more of the bigger companies doing it as opposed to the smaller businesses. Probably just because for smaller businesses, it's easier to pay people minimum wages because they're so low. But it's, like you start to see that. And there's also this implication in there that obviously this contradicts what Marx says in the Communist Manifesto, but that a way through capitalism might be through capitalism. And fun fact is Engels actually held this for 10 years of Capital Volume 3 before publishing it. And apparently it just drove him insane. He didn't know what to make of the implications, because he was tasked of sort of finalizing this very unfinished volume when Marx died. And there's a lot of, we didn't even get it translated into English, I think, till maybe the 1990s. Correct, anyone in the chat can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's interesting because while there were revolutions, we saw the revolutions in the places where it was kind of least possible, but it was also the places where they needed it the most. Like obviously, Russia, people are much more easier to kind of support anything that was on alternative to the declining czarist regime that people hated after World War One. And in Mao's China with the Civil War, there was, and the hatred towards Japan, there was a lot of, it was easier to kind of, or Vietnam against French colonialism. There's in countries where you could say it's much more difficult to implement socialism, it happened because they desired it the most. Whereas in the countries where it was most possible, like Germany, America, France, England, it was because, you know, they just didn't happen. And who analyzed that? That's where you get like Gramsci and the Frankfurt School analyzed that in its cultural hegemony ideology of these problems, right? And that's where I think, like, for the West, the primary objective is ideology, because we just don't have that same circumstances for revolution like really existing socialist states did.
Thank you very much. You know, one thing that struck me as quite interesting with this conversation when it comes to the development of the productive forces is that in many ways it seems like we miss out on one of the key components of the productive forces. Because we know that the productive forces is comprised of labor and the means of production. And we never really look at labor when we talk about the development of the productive forces. We tend to just think about technology. We just think about automation. We don't think about actually like developing the workers, you know, developing people and gearing people towards socialism or towards communism. And you know, I think that in some ways the accelerationist kind of stuff, it seems to be trying to get at developing that through the superstructural kind of layer in some ways. When I was reading the Accelerate manifesto, a lot of what it was saying was geared towards having, like, you know, think tanks and various superstructural methods for developing working class consciousness and trying to build up that aspect of the productive forces. But I don't know. I wonder if you had any thoughts on that, if you wanted to talk about that a little bit. I think it's a really interesting thing. I did think it was very interesting, these sort of superstructural tweaks that were sort of suggested in the Acceleration Manifesto. Did you want to talk about that a little bit more? Or?
For sure. Yeah. Well, I think that's a crucial aspect of the struggle, at least in countries with highly brainwashed populations, like like my country,
Yeah, mine too.
the United States, England. Yeah, like a lot of, it's, let's just say, like, the barrier is certainly ideology, because people don't always just vote on, or, you know, act politically in terms of their interests. Okay, but so in terms of the reason why I think they include that superstructural aspect of the institutions, which Nick Cernicek delves into more depth in the Inventing the Future, because we need to kind of have ways of doing propaganda. So in Lenin's day, there was newspapers. That was obviously the big thing, as to how to educate the working class. But even then, there was obviously people were much more, okay, how do I say it? Oh, so okay, this is how I put it. More education, more information is not necessarily good. And when the capitalists are in power of the state and the ideological state apparatuses, it's actually much worse. So you could say people in Russia were, you know, in Lenin's time, a vast majority of the population was illiterate. Yeah, but they had a revolution. Well, sometimes less. I think there's a Mao quote where he says the reason why he chose the peasantry, is he thought the peasantry was like a very revolutionary force, was because they were kind of not, they were blank slates and not infected by the capitalist ideology, or something along those lines. I'm paraphrasing, and that they kind of understood Marxism intuitively through their experiences. But we're just not in that case. Like, people's minds are in most developed places of the world, like even the working class, because everyone has access to the internet. Most people go through primary education, and a lot of the curriculum is filled with propaganda. I know a lot of people could say the same, but in my education, you know, I was taught basically what happened was you had communism, and then communism didn't work because of human nature and authoritarianism, and then capitalism was just better. Like you always get these narratives that are spoken as if they are the truth. And yeah, so many people just believe it, to even the point where people who are slightly on the left, the only place they can go is sort of to the social democratic end. You see, like, people are so brainwashed to the point where even leftists, a lot of leftists, are heavily brainwashed.
Oh yeah.
Now, I don't want to accuse all anarchists of being anarchists because the USSR is scary. But that is a lot of reason for Western anarchists who I've talked to. Like, I talked to so many anarchists, and it's like, well, like, how do you want to achieve anarchist communism? And it's like, well, I read Conquest of Bread, and I really like his society. And I'm like, well, have you looked at like what Marx said about a transitionary phase, or Lenin? And it's like, well, I'm not a fan of the state.
Yeah,
I think a
lot
lot
of the baby leftists,
there's so many assumptions, right?
Or like a lot of the baby anarchists,
well,
I think, are very, very on that kind of train. But I think there are some more developed anarchists who
for sure,
who have read their Marx, and they've got some conception
really
of a
like
transition, but it's just a little bit different.
I like Murray Bookchin, for instance. Like, Murray Bookchin is one of the few anarchist theorists who makes a lot of sense to me.
He's got some great.
I like
great
David Gray.
I love that text.
Yeah.
He talks about lifestyle anarchism or social anarchism. That's a great one.
Yeah.
So funny. He's hilarious the way he writes as well. David Graeber is interesting as well. I've got that the Debts.
Yeah, I like him as well.
That book Debt? It's like a big red book.
That's
Debt.
excellent. Yeah,
it's really good. What is it, like?
And Bullshit Jobs. Bullshit Jobs is excellent.
Yeah. Rest in peace, David Graeber.
I've worked a bullshit job for a very long time, and that book really resonated with me, because like a lot of the time people, well, okay, here's the thing, right? Is that's why I think you can really mobilize a lot of people on the idea of reducing the working day and working week, because there's other things to life. Like, the people who are against this tend to be more very old school orthodox Marxists, or not even Marxist, but like you'll have like a lot of just people with conservative ideology who have this idea that, well, what will we do without working less? Like, what is the point of life? And it's like, Jesus, fuck. Like, that's so nihilistic. It's like, I think like, let's look at, like, I'm sure you get a lot more pleasure out of what you do on your YouTube channel, like kind of, educating people on socialism/communism than you do from your work. And I would say the same for what I do right on my channel. Like, there's a lot of people, and it doesn't even have to be like, artistic or careers or whatnot. Some people just want to see their family more. That's right. There's this idea. What would people do if they work less? I mean, it's called the aristocracy. There's been classes of people that existed for so long.
Have you met
that
landlords?
Don't do any work. Oh yeah, literally. It's like exactly landlords. It's like, what would we do if we don't work? It's like
1%. Jesus.
There's a
Christ.
whole.
Our society's run by people who don't fucking work.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I mean, we need to have that discourse, right? Is a kind of, and I think it is a way to persuade people. It is like what I tell people. Okay, there's many ways you can define socialism/communism. I think the proper way is workers owning the means of production, and people interpret that in their own ways, right? But the way I've kind of, how do I say, like, pilled my friends. I don't know how to say it, but it is. I kind of say, like, socialism is free time, free time, and nothing else. It's also you own what you produce. So like that's another important factor. I say that in my videos a lot. But like, I think free time, that should be a big point of unity among a lot of leftists, to kind of, at least as a baseline for praxis. And then to go back to your original question, which we kind of got off track of, regarding the superstructural thing, is I think one way to kind of counteract the capitalist hegemony of ideology that we have, the capitalist realism that there's no alternative, and that any alternative at best is social democracy. I think we need to kind of build a kind of, it sounds like post-work socialism, not like we don't work at all, you know what I mean, but like a post-work socialism. And that's important, because how did the neoliberals spread their message? The neoliberals did not have good policies. Like, they're not popular on paper. But neoliberals, they spread their ideas. Like Milton Friedman was saying, well, it's more freedom, freedom, freedom. This idea of globalization, interconnectedness, freedom. You need like
Freedom
ideas that
from
people
job
can just
security. I love that. Marx talks about that. I think Marx, he talks about, I think, is it
Yeah.
chapter 4 or chapter 5 of
Negative
Capital?
freedom.
Negative freedom. That's it exactly. Freedom
negative
from.
Yeah, it's when he
freedom
critiques
to.
the liberals.
Yeah, that's right. That's so funny. Shit, this was dealt with like
exactly.
150 years ago.
It's just easy to remember, whereas people will say like, oh, dictatorship of the proletariat, seizing
sound as
control.
good.
It's like, it's way too long for most regular people. Like, we need a baseline of consent, right? Because obviously, if let's say in the future, a long time, there's like a revolution, you need people like not everyone's going to participate. It's always a small minority actually who participates in the revolution, but you need like a large part of the population to at least have consent with that,
Like
whether or not
passive
they
support.
participate or not. Yeah, tacit consent at least, because I think now if you had a revolution, it would be labeled as a terrorist group,
Yeah.
and you would have a much more stronger authoritarian state apparatus, and people would probably not only be against the revolution, they would probably actively support a fascist counter-revolution. So it's why I think that building that consent is so important, right? Is you need people to at least support it. You need to be open to it. Right now, I think, like a lot of people who are baby leftists, right? And they might not, know the ins and outs of Marxism or whatnot. They might just have gone into socialist ideas through Bernie Sanders. But I think if you had a revolution, there would be a lot of those people who would support it. But a lot of the rest of the population, definitely not.
Yeah.
I think there's still like this ideology of nonviolence, or this like not even just nonviolence. There's this anti-communism ideology, right?
Yeah. Both sides. Yeah, as we can see, both sides have guns. They're both storming the Capitol. Yeah, you can definitely see how.
Yeah, well, the storming the Capitol is the perfect example, because what did the media and a lot of the discourse surrounding that? It was getting mad at what they did, not why they did it. It was about, they're saying they're treason. They're doing it's treason, and that they infringed on the White House. It's violence. It's bad, but they didn't attack them because they're fascists, right?
Yeah.
So that should tell you everything. Like I bet you if like not even real communists did that, but if like Black Lives Matter or Antifa people did that, they would get slaughtered.
Yeah, slaughtered, maybe taken in and tortured beforehand.
Yeah.
Slaughtered would probably be preferable to what the capitalist hegemony might actually do. Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. We haven't gone to any of the Q&As. It's like an hour and 15 minutes in. I think we should probably get to a few Q&As.
Yeah, for sure.
We'll be here for like 20 hours. This is a fake name asked, given the criticisms of postmodernism at the start, does accelerationism demand Marxists study more than theory? I know that Srinriksek, I can't pronounce the name, that name that we were talking about beforehand. Nick
Cernicek.
Yeah, that's the one. Cernicek, that's how you pronounce it. I know that Cernicek does deep dives into platform economics or infrastructure. So any thoughts? Does accelerationism demand Marxists study more than theory?
Well, it depends what you mean by theory, like economics. I'm not sure what really the question is, but I would say, just to clarify, is postmodern theory and accelerationism are very different angles. Is Nick Cernicek is actually explicitly not postmodern. He actually in Inventing the Future advocates for what he calls a left modernity. Something that I actually agree with is that I have a postmodern analysis of society, in that I think we have like a lack of meta narratives, but I think we should have a kind of socialist narrative. That makes sense. A socialist left modernity. Because realistically, you need ways to mobilize people. And I think narratives will always be powerful. And if we don't have any narrative, we're just vague resistance or just vague social justice. There's nothing, we're going to lose out to the right, who always has meta narratives at their disposal. Right? Of like, going back to the past. But reading more than theory, I think history. I think history, theory without history is. You need history more than anything, in my opinion, because theory is just a tool. I look at theory as a pair of goggles, and whenever you learn new types of theory, it's lenses that kind of open your perspective on interpreting things. But the history is just the raw knowledge, because frankly, a lot of people who are very anti-communist just don't know the history, because they'll say, oh, they won't know about US imperialism. I've noticed understanding the history of imperialism is one of the biggest radicalizing factors for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Understanding why such and such a state had to do what it had to do, in attempting to break away from that imperialism, breaking away against, the global hegemons at the time. Yeah, brilliant. Demands Marxist study more than theory. Again, it's a very vague. It's kind of a vague question. What is theory? How do we understand it? I mean, Marxist theory. Like, what are we talking about specifically here? Marxism has developed so much. I mean, obviously, we need to be looking at the practice. I agree. We really need to be studying history, what worked, what didn't work, in terms of how we can actually build and develop and grow. We can advance socio-historical development. But definitely practice as well. Actually trying things out, seeing what works and seeing what doesn't work.
Yeah, I noticed like people can't think in between like dialectically, because there's a tendency for, okay, I know what J. Paul calls movementism, like people who just like want direct action right away. It's what Nick Cernicek calls folk politics.
That's right. Yeah.
It's just like doing things to do it. It's like, okay, let's go to a protest. Do we have any demands? Oh, who cares?
Yeah.
It's like just doing things. Action for action's sake, I think, is super pointless. You need to have strategy, and at the same time, what I don't like is like there's a whole other side. Is that there's like the academic theory people who all they do is like read theory and debate about Deleuze's body of organs and like and not even like and try to tie it to real world issues. Like that kind of annoys me too. Like
the armchairs.
Yeah. It's just like it's a circle jerk sometimes, like of people just trying to brag about how much Deleuze they read. But I think there needs to be that you need theory, absolutely, and you also need to like analyze strategically. I think strategies. If I were to add, if there's anything that lacks the most, is strategy. That's really important. Like we need to have the explicit aim of also trying to make more people adopt a socialist disposition, because there's often what happens on YouTube, right? Is people just end up becoming like products, and then their viewers become consumers. So you have like you'll have like very niche areas where it's not even trying to like educate people, and it's just like pandering to an audience. Like it's always bad. Like I really like your recent videos, really basically explaining social class and stuff like that. Stuff like that's necessary, because you need like if we're not trying to bring people to the movement, like what's the point, right?
But that's a really interesting point. Like when it comes to this, because this is something that I've thought a lot about recently. Well, because I've been struggling financially recently, I've kind of had to think a lot about this. There's a lot of pressure on us if you're creating left-wing content to basically abide by the dictates of the market, make whatever's most profitable. Whatever you see is making a lot of money, getting a lot of views, getting a lot of clicks, that's what you need to be making. It doesn't matter about whether or not it's actually educating people, whether or not it's actually raising people's political consciousness. What you need to do is you just need to do what's going to make you money, and that could be like reaction videos, drama videos, creating needless infights with other leftists for over stupid fucking reasons. This person's
Chud
dunking, yeah, all this kind of stuff. It comes to mind, for example, like Hakeem spoke about this in the last stream. Hakeem kind of exploded. His channel exploded from like, he had about like 20,000 subscribers, and he went up to like 80 or 90,000 subscribers now. And so I asked him like, what he attributed this to, and in the last stream he said that it was like the reaction videos. It was responding to like Pray For You and all this sort of stuff. So it's like these kind of reaction, these kind of response videos. They get a lot of clicks and a lot of traffic, and it's strange. I think he did like a little questionnaire thing. Like you can put little polls out and ask. Yeah. He asked, what do people want? Do people want like more theory, more educational stuff? Do they want more like reaction stuff or more like response stuff? What people want? And like nobody wanted the response stuff. Nobody wanted that. Everybody wanted like the theory and the educational stuff. But the stuff that's actually getting him views is the response stuff, you know, it is the reaction stuff. And so if you're sort of,
it's kind of a tragedy.
It's a massive tragedy. Like if you're sort of forced to go with the dictates of the market, that's what you need to do. And like we all have things that we need to pay for. We all have families. We all have people to look after. We need to look after ourselves. We need to pay our bills. You know, being a Marxist doesn't mean you're exempt from needing to pay for shelter or food or clothing or warmth or any of that stuff. And so people need to you know, sort of bend down to the will of the market. And you know, so it's a really interesting point that you brought up there. And you know, it's kind of,
well, like I'll say, to be fair, is Hakim's reaction videos kind of spread socialist ideas also, because he kind of like debunks a lot of propaganda. So I'll say like that I guess that's an exception, but like there is, I know what you mean. There's a side of BreadTube, so-called BreadTube, whatever, that just reacts to right wingers and does, or the way, what I hate the most, to be honest, is political hobbyism. People just reacting to political news and saying, you know, like what strikes me is people will be always worried about, they'll be saying AOC didn't do this, AOC did that, and it's like, you're really expecting like this much out of a politician?
Yeah, like
in a bourgeois republic. It's like, it's such stupid, like it's ridiculous to me. Like and it annoys me too, is because I don't think covering news all the time is really the best way to educate people, to be honest, because I think,
yeah, especially if it is just about, as you said, like these sort of bourgeois parliamentarians. It's not necessarily, maybe it's great if you're shining a light on the struggles of people like in the developing world. I mean, that's fantastic, you know, shine a light on the struggles of people in the global south, what's going on in the Philippines or India or this or that, the other. That can be quite useful.
Yeah, we need more of that.
Definitely. But you know, such and such a bourgeois politician said this or that. Even if they are kind of left wing or left leaning bourgeois parliamentarians, they're still. It's still just the show, you know, the drama of bourgeois parliamentary democracy. It's not actually advancing the proletarian struggle. It's not actually advancing proletarian liberation. It's not elevating the consciousness of the masses. Generally speaking, there are exceptions, of course. Some people use those. Some people use these as like platforms to bounce off, to push people beyond them, to expose the limitations of these systems, which I think is useful in some ways. But as you said, like with, as you said, some what you might call BreadTube, some parts of that, they're not necessarily doing that. They're not trying to get people beyond that towards socialism, you know.
Yeah, there's a whole dystopia of just algorithms and the way they infect consciousness, which is something I kind of want to write about in the future. But it's too. I don't know if I want to get into depth on that. But what you do see is people becoming identities, and they become their audience. So they're afraid to ever say anything that their audience doesn't like.
So much,
that's a big thing. They can't.
Christ.
I mean, like you felt the ramifications of that, where it's like you just had some like, what it's like the basic tenet of Maoism is self-criticism, and you literally question China, and then people just came after you. It's insane.
Yeah. Well, I think people were upset that I kind of moved from more of like an ML to more of an MLM position. I think people were a little bit upset about that, and I can understand that. I mean, people sort of, they get attached to these figures. They think, oh, Paul's going to defend China to his deaths. But I mean, if you're following Marxism to its natural conclusions, you're not going to do that. I mean, the ruthless criticism of all that exists except China. No, it's totally inconsistent with Marxism to take that.
In the basic, in the basic. Yeah, for sure. And the basic tenet, one of the basic tenets of Marxism is historical materialism. It's not idealism. We're supposed to analyze material economic conditions. And the way you strategize and depending on these conditions is different. You come out with different strategies, different solutions. So like to adopt, like in my opinion, one label for one place or to, I don't know. To me, I don't. The reason why I don't label myself at all, really, aside from just being a socialist / communist, is because I think there's different strategies for different places. But it's even more ridiculous to me that there's MLs and MLMs fighting, because, I mean, one is just kind of the extension of the other.
Yeah, but I mean, a lot of them don't see it that way. A lot of MLs don't really see MLMs as MLs. Like in the same way that MLs are Marxists, Marxist-Leninist Maoists are Marxist-Leninists. It's just kind of like the next kind of, it's the conclusion of there. So it's dealing with the problems of ML, you know. But a lot of people don't see it that way. But yeah, as you said, like there are a lot of people who, they get sort of typecast as a certain person, you know, they become what their audience desires. I know, for example, one of the comrades who's spoken quite a bit about this is I hope I'm not revealing anything. I don't think he'll have a problem with me saying this. But Socialist Swan, for example, was doing a whole series on the GDR and, you know, East Germany, and a lot of people were really excited.
Yeah, I've seen that actually.
It's very interesting stuff. He did a really good series, really solid series on it. But then once he steps outside that kind of box, he was saying how disappointed he was that nobody wanted to watch his videos. He talked a little bit about the Irish struggle, the Irish revolutionary struggle. He talked about this or that struggle, and people just weren't really into it. People didn't really care. He was really disappointed that he hadn't gotten, you know, the same level of engagement or views on those videos. So in a way, that kind of encourages him to keep on going, to keep on talking about East Germany. And yeah, in a way, it can be kind of stultifying, and it can be kind of unfortunately, it can kind of it can be good, it can be bad, but I mean, this is just what the market does, you know. This is the anarchy of the market, and it's very much at play even in these left-wing spaces, and people may not realize it. It's not like an individual personal choice kind of thing. It's just, this is the system, this is where we're at, and we're all you know, under a market system. We all have to play by its rules, unfortunately, you know.
I'll say there's some people who navigate this kind of very successfully, because it's really hard, like with the incentives. But someone like Second Thought is somehow able to have like a really mass appeal and shed light on from an explicitly socialist perspective, which is really interesting. Like, I'm trying to kind of learn from that, as well as I really like Renegade Cut, how he touches on. I wish Renegade Cut was more explicitly like socialist. I don't know if he is, but I think he's anti-capitalist. But I like how he uses pop culture to shed light with a kind of on issues and stuff. Like, I try to do that with my content a lot. Like, I wanted to make the most convincing case that liberals and libertarians could never agree with, could never argue with my last video about Warren Buffett. Which I was showing from Buffett's own words, that like, he's basically saying that, you know, billionaires do not work harder. Capitalism is not necessarily innovative. I got rich from Coca-Cola and Bank of America stocks. So like, I was, and then I kind of obviously go into the role of the capitalist state and the capitalist mode of production, and why you can't just blame billionaires like Bezos for everything, and how they're a product of the system. Like, there'll always be another Bezos. There'll always be another people like that. But yeah, I don't know, that's when I'm experimenting. It's often hard because then you attract people from the pop culture side, and then you attract people from the theory side and the Marxist side. And it's like pleasing different areas. Whereas I'm just kind of, I'm trying to essentially try to make a crossover, and we'll see how it works. My goal is mainly just to kind of, is to bring a lot of these ideas to like a lot of audiences. Because you know, I would say some bread tubers, they do this well. Bread tubers, they do these video essays about pop culture. Like Cuck Philosophy is an example. He does that really well with bridging different topics. But most of the bread tubers, I think Cuck Philosophy is a Marxist, but there's other like bread tubers who don't really actually spread any alternatives or really anything explicitly socialist. It's just like, it's this media criticism, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. There's definitely a lot of room for, I gotta say, like Trojan horsing Marxism.
Exactly.
Into Trojan horsing.
That's exactly what I'm trying to do.
That's exactly what it is. I mean, Trojan horsing Marxism into, you know, a Marxist analysis of cornflakes. You know, like, you can really, you know, you can do that. You can actually do that. You could do that. You could take some cornflakes and you could look at, like, you could use that to explain commodity fetishism. You know, you could actually use that to explain the separation and how we don't understand the social relations. We see it as, you know, the relation between things rather than the relations between people. I mean, you could actually do that. I suppose that's one of the really nice things about Marxism, is that it is this all-encompassing worldview that you can apply to literally anything, and you can just give it a weird view. You can just give it a weird name, like, I don't know, the problematic aspect of cornflakes, and then you could just you can go into like the working conditions of people who are creating these. You get into the profit motive for it. You get into market demand. You get into all kinds of things, you know, and suddenly you can see that there's a lot of room for bread tubers to, you know, play around with this kind of stuff if they have a solid grasp of Marxism, you know. So yeah, there's a lot of room to Trojan horse Marxist ideology out
100%.
into. So cultural criticism. But I think it is important that we do connect these to real world struggles. We do connect these to some kind of revolutionary politics that actually can advance the consciousness of the people and shine light on the actual revolutionary struggles. That's kind of one thing that I feel like I need to do more of, and I need to focus more of. It's actually guiding people towards genuine revolutionary movements that are actually challenging capitalism, like right now. It's the saddest thing. I watch Jose Maria Sison's channel all the time. Jose Maria Sison is the guy who founded the CPP, the Communist Party of the Philippines, the MPA, the revolutionary communist movement that's going on in the Philippines right now, fighting against the fascist Duterte government. And they're literally the most advanced communist organization in the world, fighting a people's war right now, and they have been for a few decades at this stage. And his channel has like 1,000 subscribers, and his videos get like 200 views if he's lucky. And I'm just like, this is so fucked up. This is bizarre. Like, why? There's no meritocracy. This is a guy who's dedicated his life to class struggle, and my channel has 20 times the amount of subscribers that he has. This is ridiculous. This makes no sense. People shouldn't be listening to me. I'm an asshole. Listen to this guy.
we need like a video with like a really flashy thumbnail and title it something like "The Dictatorship of Philippines" or something really catchy, and then just like throw them all this information about.
We do. We need to let people know that this is going on, because people just aren't aware of what's happening, and I mean, again, that's part of the market. That's stuff, And
there's also like the whole optics thing, which is why I remember I was always ambivalent to whether I want to use like hammers and sickles, and I decided not to. Is just because I noticed that just deters so many people right off the get-go.
Yeah,
I remember. Okay, so one of my favorite channels is actually Hakeem, and I remember I tried to show my friends Hakeem videos. They'd be like they'd see like the Lenin picture, they'd just be scared immediately.
Yeah, they think I don't know, Hitler. They just think they have this like equivalency in their heads, because they're raised to think that way.
Well, this is an interesting topic, because I kind of think that a political party for socialist / communist, and I say political party, not one that's explicitly necessarily trying to win elections, but as a mobilizing device, right? Which I think we need more than ever. Is that I don't think it can really be called explicitly like Marxist-Leninist or even Marxist or something like that. I think it has to be called something different. And it can still employ Marxist-Leninist, Maoist, or various tendency tactics. You can kind of like learn from different tactics and movements. But just in terms of pure optics, the name itself is just, I don't see us going anywhere with that. I think we need like I'm fine with the socialist label personally.
Depending on the part of the world, I think, in the advanced industrial, like imperialist cores, it's very scary. Communism is very scary. Hakeem actually mentioned this, I think, in one of his videos. He was saying that like in a lot of the world, like they see like the hammer and sickle, and they just see that as like advancing, as development, And a lot of the global south, they kind of see this because they kind of saw like the USSR as being quite technologically advanced and developed, and they saw Mao's China as being quite developed and quite advanced and quite far ahead of where they were at. It doesn't have the same baggage that it might have here, where people would look at the hammer and sickle and they would just see it as poverty, communism when no food, these kinds of things. And like, for example, you go to India, go to Kerala, for example, Kerala. It's in the southwest of India, and
they have like a sort of socialist government, don't they?
I mean, well, it's a communist party. I think it's the CPI Marxists who are in charge there, and they're revisionists. It's just a social democracy. It's just a social democracy, but they've got the hammer and sickle everywhere, and it's just not an issue. It's just not an issue there. Like, it's just like, okay, red flags, hammer and sickle. That's good. That's progressive. That's fine. And they do a pretty good job of like running a social democracy, to be fair to them. But it is social democracy. It's not socialism. Don't be fools.
Well, that's a good point, is that it depends on the region, right? Is some just iconography has different meanings in the collective unconscious of the society they're in, right? So like for where I live, and especially in America, it's like, I just really think there has to be completely different iconography. But certain countries, that's a good point. Is that okay? I don't know if I want to reveal that information, but anyways, let's just say Yemen. Yemen was a country that really looked up to the USSR, and communism is very popular there. And they had a communist party in power for a period of time. kind of more in the Khrushchev type of tendency, but it is a different, like, I remember when I heard, I'm not going to reveal the people, but let's just say people there saw the USSR as like a safety net, as a sense of security, like an advanced power that was combating the West. So it's definitely a point. It's like the hammer and sickle can work in some areas, and it's very different. But like I would in Canada or America, Britain, I just think,
Yeah.
even if we imply like revolutionary tactics, it just has to be different branding. You know what I mean? Like
In
kind
Ireland,
of
yeah, as
we're
well.
in it, yeah.
It's very similar in Ireland. Like the hammer and sickle just seems like this strange, weird thing that's like from Russia or from like China, like in the mid 20th century. It just seems like a strange thing to use in Ireland. That's why I generally use like the starry plough. Like people have sometimes asked me why it looks like I've got like the Big Dipper in my pictures, the little stars that you see. That's the starry plough, and it's a symbol of socialist republicanism. But socialist republicanism is basically just it's a way for us to smuggle like Marxism and Maoism.
It's a
and
smart
Leninism
way
in.
too, yeah.
Yeah, and it works pretty well, because like if you go out and you talk about like James Connolly to an Irish person, and you talk about all this kind of thing, people get really excited and they're just like, yes, national liberation, 32 county socialist republic. But when you start talking about like Lenin, or you start talking about Mao, people their faces just kind of go blank. They're just like, how is this relevant to where we're at right now?
And it's just way too hard to explain people like what happened too.
Yeah,
because it's just really difficult. Like it's rare even to almost, even if you might give like a convincing defense, and sometimes they're like very justified defenses because of like the circumstances, people just still won't really buy it. It's just way too hard. I mean, I feel like it's like, okay, one thing is obviously, okay, Lenin, Mao, even Stalin are not comparable to like any fascist whatsoever. But like that's how they're seen, right, in the public consciousness in America, in a lot of Western countries. And so like I like what do the fascists do? Okay, they don't say we're Mussoliniist or Hitlerist or
yep, that's true.
all of that. Like they call themselves different. They don't even call themselves fascists. They say we're third positionists, or
fourth
we're all these
positionists.
different things. Yeah, it's insane. Like I mean, there's some people I'm sure you'll know exactly who I'm talking about, and we won't mention his name, but
not gonna say the name.
There's like there's a very popular YouTuber out there who's like a literal Nazi, but calls himself third positionist, and it's like, and a lot of people just buy into it, and it's an easy way for them to say, oh, Hitler, no, it's, I don't know about that. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's
just kind of like an obscurantism.
I kind of, yeah.
And that's kind of it. They just obscure the reality, and they'll kind of they'll gesture towards some progressive kind of left sounding kind of stuff, some kind of workerist sounding stuff, economistic kind of sounding stuff. You know, they might even talk about like the proletariat, the bourgeoisie, things like that. And
yep.
You know, so it can.
Well, I mean, that's exactly what Hitler did, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Hitler literally.
Jesus, Hitler talked about proletarian nationalism, of all things, proletarian nationalism.
Well,
which is a joke.
A good bridge to this is like, I really think the left should kind of redefine freedom and reclaim the idea of freedom, because in liberal societies they've kind of hegemonized that idea, and the right has it's a perceived that often that if we have socialism, it's like a sacrifice. Which we need to get rid of that idea. We need to get the idea that people's lives will objectively improve. It's not just a sacrifice, and that it's not a sacrifice of freedom, because, you know, obviously in liberal societies, it's a negative freedom. We need to see like freedom. I like the term, okay, from the theorist Max Horkheimer, who's in the Frankfurt School, is freedom is not having to work to live. Like freedom is being able to do a lot of what you want, which you're constrained economically. So the left should claim that, I think, for sure.
Yeah, I think that Angela Davis said some things about that as well. She talked about as well, like this idea of freedom in the US just meant freedom to starve. That's no freedom. You know, is pretty powerful as well. Yes.
Or to buy 8 different cereals.
1 million different toothbrushes. Yeah. Brands of toothbrush. You know, yes, I agree there, but I also want to like put a little note of caution there, because I have seen a lot of the how can I say, Deng Xiaoping theorists really get into this idea. I'm just gonna say Deng Xiaoping theorists, because I don't want to be super sectarian, but they get really into this idea, and they really play up a lot of like petty bourgeois ideologies. They really pander to essentially the American dream, like continuing this idea of the American dream. You've heard people
The
talk about.
Chinese dream.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
Chinese dream. But no, like I'm even like in the USA, you've got people talking about like socialism with American characteristics, talking about like abundance and how under socialism everything's just gonna get better. You're gonna have more. It's gonna be what we have now, but more. You're gonna have more and more and more of that, and everything's gonna be okay. We're gonna advance the productive forces, and there's just gonna be more. So while yes, things
Right.
will improve for our class, for the masses, for the workers, things will improve for our class. I would also push back on the idea that like people are saying things like socialist, talking about like socialist billionaires and stuff like that.
Oh well, that's ridiculous.
That's just like the most extreme. And but the thing is, I do see a lot of these Deng Xiaoping enjoyers really taking that seriously. So
well, no matter
push
what,
back
I
a
don't
little
think
bit.
we'll never be able to get billionaires and millionaires on our side. Like I just think let's just forget that.
Forget about it. Yeah.
So, but like when it comes to like, I think okay, if there's any aspects of the capitalist class that can be appealed to, maybe the petite bourgeoisie, because
especially the lower sections of it. Yeah.
Yeah, they often rely on their own labor too to kind of maintain it. So it's to maintain their businesses. So and often, I mean, there's this idea that okay, capitalists take more risk, and that's why they should be rewarded. And that's not always true. But small businesses do take more risk, and that it sucks to be a small business owner. And that's an argument not to have like, a capitalist class. Like that's why we should have like workers own the means of production, because it is like a stressful thing, and it does create a lot of conflict. But yeah, I think some aspects of the petite bourgeoisie are convertible, but millionaires, billionaires, definitely not, because their life is not going to get better than under a socialist system.
Definitely not.
It's just not.
Just
And okay, there is yeah. So there's people like Aaron Bastiani in Fully Automated Luxury Communism who have this idea of like luxury communism. And I will say there is some criticisms of that, because I think we don't often consider the global south.
Yeah.
Because we will need to redistribute wealth like immensely to the global south. I mean, I think that's just a given, because so much of what they've lost, especially Africa, is literally to England and France and America, Portugal, Spain. So Italy. So there's a lot of that needs to happen. But I think we will have even more so the capabilities to give people the basics of life guaranteed, and to have more freedom. But I don't think this idea that we're all going to be like, at least I don't know, at least not in the near future whatsoever, to be living in like some Star Trek paradise. Definitely not. But I think I do like the idea of like a kind of semi-utopian imaginary. I mean, and even the USSR had that for a little bit. Like there was sort of that a dream idea of like, that's kind of why they went to space, right? Is to build this idea that they're going to become more technologically advanced and give abundance. And I think in a purely rhetorical perspective, that's an important way to mobilize people, I think. Like people need to have like something to look forward to, like something they're striving for.
That's a really difficult thing for us to do, especially if we're like materialists, because like we're so hesitant to maybe venture into the realm of like idealism, where a lot of this is kind of getting into the imaginary and the ideal and sort of this. But it is true, like we do kind of there needs to be like an endpoint that people can imagine like things are going to get better, rather than just saying like things are shit now, we're just going to move forward and hope things are better as we move forward. But
or regress. Like that's what a lot of movementism is all about. It's like localism, consume less, just like live minimalist life. We can live on a commune. Like, I'm sorry, like I don't want to live in like a stinky commune with a bunch of anarchists. I just really don't. And I don't think that would last. They almost like always fail. It's like we have to really have a sense of community and a sense of progression. That's why what I mean by left modernity is that, okay, I think there'll always be narratives, and these things can be co-opted by religion often. And I would say maybe some socialist states maybe can use religion. I think in the Middle East, for instance, I don't envision a kind of socialism that doesn't somehow use Islam. Like I just like try to co-opt it. But I think if we don't have a meta narrative like that, society is going to get better, we're not striving towards some kind of much better advanced society, we will lose the meta narrative to some sort of like fascism.
Yeah, fascism does the meta narratives. They're really into their meta narratives, getting into the history and just falsifying, fictionalizing, just making up meta narratives. They're crazy about it, and they'll jump on the opportunity. So, yeah. Come here to me. I need to run to the bathroom. I need to run quickly. I don't want to like finish this up like in the next 10 seconds because we're having a good conversation.
Sure.
I'd like to
Is there
continue.
any question actually want me to
Yeah.
answer
Well,
while
yeah.
you're
There's a
gone?
couple. There's a couple of questions there. There's a couple of questions that I think we should probably come to. I've put them into the shared document. I've put 3 questions that we've been asked. I'll just read out the first one now. So in our little
Sure, I
Google
can.
Doc, you can see it's up at the top there. There's 3 of them. There's one from Alex and 2 from Matthew Calise. So the first one here from Alex, Paul. But so would voting for a social democrat? I think this is back when we were talking about like Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn and all these sorts of characters. So, would voting for Social Democrats who push for higher wages and nationalising industries, which would lower the rate of profit and lead to conflict, be accelerationist? So, you can take that question, and there's a couple more from Matthew.
Sure.
Is that okay with you? Do you wanna take them?
Yeah, that's totally fine.
Cool.
Yeah.
Back in a sec.
So yeah. So Alex, basically that's actually what a left accelerationist project would want is we would want to push for higher wages because that gives incentivize automation. And we can say, oh, we should resist automation, but we can't really resist it. It'll happen, but it'll happen more faster if we push for higher wages. And to resist it, we would not pay for higher wages. So what do we want? We should want higher wages, and we also accelerate the productive forces of automation. And automation, if used under a socialist society or even a social democracy, would vastly improve life and reduce the working day. And when you reduce the working day, you have more opportunities and time to actually organize and kind of build a class consciousness. Now, nationalizing industries, I don't see I don't think a social democratic government would actually nationalize an industry unless it would pull a kind of Boris Johnson scenario where it would nationalize a industry that is going broke or not making any money and then try to make it competitive again. Because capitalism naturally actually tends towards privatization because it has to maintain an upward level of economic growth. So it'll do the opposite of nationalize. It would actually privatize more and cut more because the falling rate of profit usually leads to that. Now, there's a lot of things to get in with automation. So yes, you would have with higher wages, you would have higher expenses, and then it would become more desirable to use more automation and various technologies to essentially replace workers for capitalists. That would be an incentive. But in many cases, okay, so there's a reason why the capitalist class likes ultimately having wage labor as opposed to no wages. And that's because wages, as Marx analyzes in Wage, Labor, and Capital, wages are the part of the variable costs of the productive process in capitalism. So why variable costs, they can be kind of tweaked when there's a falling rate of profit. So what do you see in crises all the time whenever there's a falling rate of profit? The first thing they do is often fire workers or cut pay or cut benefits. That's why the variable cost is very powerful for the capitalists because they can always tweak that whenever there's a falling rate of profit. Or in the case of Tesla, is a notable example, is when their stock goes up so much because of the investor class and they're not earning enough, they're not getting enough profits to justify that high investment, they start actually cutting labor in a lot so that they can have an overall better net profit. Now, when you have automation, it's no longer a variable cost, it's a fixed cost because it's a robot. You can't, it's not something like you can cut the robot's pay or you can fire the robot. It's a fixed cost. And this actually accelerates a contradiction of capital because there's not a way to get away from that profit crisis. And so automation does this because there's not a variable cost in which they can kind of go towards to deal with the falling rate of profit. So you get a crisis right there. But I think a crisis won't necessarily be always a good thing. You need to have a left ready to seize power in some way. I think that's very crucial in a time like this. You need to be prepared, kind of as the neoliberals were when Keynesianism started to collapse, to take power. The socialist left needs to really be prepared for that. And there's also, this is not related to your question, but it's kind of related, is there's also a rise of intangible assets. So a lot of corporations now make money from things like intellectual property or things that essentially have no marginal cost to produce. And this is actually becoming increasingly so. And when you have 3D printing, there's actually able to produce literal commodities without any marginal cost. So they don't have to hire more workers or pay more to produce more because they have 3D printers, which it can produce things at a zero marginal cost. And then gradually, capitalism doesn't make sense. And you have had arguments from people like Jeremy Rifkin and Paul Mason, who are not really explicitly socialists. They use terms like post-capitalist, and they kind of say like this will bring an end to capitalism. But I'm skeptical in that. I think no matter what, the capitalist class will hold on to power, and if it desires them, they will just make money off of things like intellectual property or rentierism till they can survive. So I think it's up to the left to see this crisis eventually and kind of seize power.
Based. That sounded super big brained. I jumped in halfway through and I was like, oh yeah, he's going heavy on the Marxism. Nice. Okay, great. Thank you. But that was the first question, and that was the question on Lauren Rate Profit and leading to conflict being accelerationist. Is that right? Just still the question by Alex?
Yeah, I answered it.
Cool, great. Let's take a look at the next couple of questions from Matthew Calise then. There's two of them. Paul, can you ask about digital feudalism as one possible outcome of the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution? Same comrade asks, Paul, can you ask whether the comrade thinks accelerationism is just nihilism or defeatism dressed up as socialism? So, what do you think?
I'll do the second one very first, just because it's really easy to answer. Is that, well, there's things like purely what I call this internet ideologies, like unconditional accelerationism or right accelerationism, which is just nihilism. But I don't really think. I would say it's fatalism, because fatalism believes in a kind of destiny, whereas nihilism just sees the kind of, in my opinion, nihilism can be a dialectical approach, because you see the negativities, the contradictions in things, and you can kind of face reality a lot easier and more come to grips with problems. So in the left, accelerationism is more of a descriptive analysis, in my view. It's not so much of a ideology. Like, I don't go around calling myself a left accelerationist. Like, I don't see the point. Like, I just see it as a Marxist interpretation and a kind of way of looking at the world and how we can deal with it. It doesn't apply to everything. I mean, I think it applies to places where the productive forces are most advanced and accelerating the fastest. So your other question, you said, can you ask about digital feudalism and the Fourth Industrial Revolution? Okay, so for those who don't know, the Fourth Industrial Revolution is this idea proposed by the is it the World Health Organization, or is it I forget, they're in Davos, and I forget what they're called.
Yeah, I know the one that's
it's Klaus Schwab, the neo-Keynesian economist, who kind of proposes it. It's not something actually put in. The World Economic Forum.
Yes, that's it. Yeah.
So it's basically like they see the crisis of capitalism and they kind of want to deal with it. Frankly, I don't think we have much of option here, because if revolution was on the table, that would be on the table. But in a lot of developed Western countries, I just don't see that right now. And if we're between a neo-Keynesianism and a neo-fascism, I would choose neo-Keynesianism in a matter of a heartbeat. It would be vastly better, because if you have higher wages, or in at least something like UBI, you can at least have a little bit more time for the working class to kind of organize and mobilize and see how to overcome Keynesianism. Now, digital feudalism, this is a sort of narrative I hear from a lot of people, that we're approaching digital feudalism. And I don't really quite agree with the implication, because, and it's not really Marxist in my opinion, because feudalism implies that it's a regression. And we're not, frankly, what we're experiencing is just capitalism in a heightened mode of production.
Yep.
Feudalism was a zero growth economy. So like, there's nothing feudalist, at least, well, in England has remnants of feudalism, and you could say the Philippines still has remnants of feudalism, right? With kind of like the aristocracy still existing. But like, we're not in a feudalist.
That's important. The peasantry and landlords and things like that. I mean, those are kind of semi-feudal elements, we could say.
Yeah. But there's this assumption that kind of worse capitalism, as we get more unequal, that this is somehow a regression to feudalism. But that's actually always been the state of capitalism. Like, the state of capitalism in which Marx was analyzing slowly became what was the Gilded Age. And that was like, now we're reapproaching the Gilded Age, but that's capitalism. That's
Mm.
not feudalism. So I just think we're in a kind of late neoliberal capitalism. It's not so much, we're not digital feudalism. And what can we do? I mean, if we could overcome this much easily, or I mean, sure, I think we should, if we use the productive forces, it should be better directed by the working class. If that was an option, I mean, yes, I'd be all for that. That's why I'm not, I don't, I don't, I don't like denounce Marxist Leninists or even anarchists or groups like that. Like I still agree with their aims generally.
Mm.
It's just, I just don't think it's possible right now. This is my view, and where I kind of sympathize with the left accelerationist view a little bit. And digital feudalism, I think we can definitely end up to a very dangerous area of capitalism in which the productive forces get so advanced that you can get like private robot armies to just eliminate people, or you have things like genomics, which is another, I guess you could say, interesting innovation in capitalism, which could be, I think it can only be used properly in a socialist society, because it would be so dangerous in a capitalist one where people like, it would just be Blade Runner. People would extend their life. And yeah, so I think the person who commented has the right, like, I know what they're saying. I just don't like the term feudalism. I think it misses kind of the economic analysis, because
Yeah.
we're not really regressing. This is actually capitalism doing what capitalism does.
Mm. That's a really, really good analysis. Sometimes people do get a little bit confused because they see some things that happened during feudalism that are kind of coming back now. You know, like for example, enclosure of the commons is a big one that people talk about, because that was like a big thing. Like when moving to capitalism, the enclosure of the commons, the changes in the laws to make that possible. And of course, we see this kind of enclosing of the commons happening again and again. We see it happening like with the internet and stuff like that. People talk about like cyber feudalism and digital feudalism and all this kind of stuff. And because they see like on the internet, there is this kind of enclosure to commons happening like right now. There's this new space to be enclosed. And they'll talk about like landlordism and rentierism and all these kinds of things, but that's not exactly, these don't actually reflect the Marxist understanding of feudalism. They don't reflect the relations of production under the feudal period as a historical stage of development. As you said, this is an intensification of capitalist relations of production, even when it comes to questions like landlordism and stuff like that, like the landlord, the situation, the conditions of a landlord under capitalism are different to the landlords of feudalism. So I think that's like a really important point to draw a line under. Like if you read Capital Volume 3, they really get into it, and Marx really gets into how land becomes capital in capitalism, which is quite different to how it was understood historically. So yeah, so when we're moving forward now, like into the internet, and let's just this is all capital. This is all being transformed into capital. It's not going back. It's not returning to feudal relations of production, and so it's inaccurate, and it kind of blurs and obfuscates a historical materialist understanding of social historical development.
One thing I think that we can definitely learn from Marx in a literal sense is that I don't think we should try to. We can't. There's some things like that's. We can't simply change. Like, for example, we can't just say no to the productive forces of capital. Like, it's happening. It's an analysis. It's whether do we want the working class to have the power, or do we want to benefit from it? Do we want to change the mode, like who's in charge of the mode of production? These are questions that are important, but like I don't think we can just simply reject technology or simply reject reality.
We're not smashing up the machines. They're okay with us. We just want to own them. We want the proletariat to be in control of them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, great stuff. Thank you very much. I think we've pretty much touched on those questions. Okay, so we've been going for a bit.
Any last ones?
Yeah, we've gone for a bit 2 hours now. I think those are the big questions that we've had. I'm not sure. I didn't see any other questions. Let me just see here. I see the Falcon General has tagged me saying, Dengists and Voshites are the same. Which is just a hilarious thing to say. I think both of those groups would be very upset that you said that.
I think people take Vaush too seriously. Like I always see people react to Vaush, and it's like, I mean, why react to Vaush? Like it's a streamer. Like that's always my response is people who will say, "Oh, Vaush said this. I'm so outraged," and it's like he's a 24-year-old, like 26-year-old streamer. It's like I don't expect much.
Well,
like
you remember we were
I don't
talking
know.
earlier
Yeah.
about like the market and how, when you talk about Vaush, you're going to drum up a lot of attention. Doing a
True.
response video to Vaush, you're going to get a lot of eyes on you for that because of the sort of
It's like
excitement
back in
and
the
engagement he
back in the
gets.
day, it was Lenin and Kautsky and Marx and LaSalle debating. Now we have fucking Vaush. It's
Vaush and
like
Destiny.
let's not talk about like these YouTubers. They're just not important.
We shouldn't
Like
worry
I
about it.
think okay, I don't hate Vaush.
I
I
don't
don't
either,
really
yeah.
watch him enough to really hate him, I guess. But yeah, I don't watch him at all, so I don't really. I guess maybe that's why I don't hate him. But I just don't think it's like, why are we focusing on this? That's just my point anyway.
The market.
Like it's like what you
The
were saying
market's
earlier.
way.
Like there's just more important things, right?
Oh, big time. Big time. What's Joma? What's Joma's channel? Listen to Joma. Look at the struggles that are going on in the Philippines and India and all parts of the world right now. There's
link that in
far
the
more
link that in the
points.
chat.
Yeah, I will actually. That's a really good idea. I better do that. Do you want to? I know we touched before we started the stream. We were going to talk a little bit about like propaganda and that and the importance of that.
Sure.
We kind of touched on it a little bit. Do you want to return to that and maybe just flesh it out a little bit more before we wrap things up? And then
Sure thing.
This can be kind of the final thing that we'll talk about, and then we'll wrap things up.
Absolutely. Okay, so first of all, we need to ask, how is capitalism sustained? Ideology.
Base superstructure
Ideology
base,
is
and so on and so forth. Like
circular.
circular.
Except that I think that like some theorists that come after Engels, like Althusser and Gramsci, Zizek as well later, is that I think they see ideology as more important, and I think in the Western world it's very important because ideology prevents you from seeing contradiction that's right in front of you. Like where you'll have working class people vote for Trump, or you'll have all kind of contradictions. So how do you overcome ideology? I don't think you can at the same time just attack groups you don't agree with. And at the same time, I see there's this weird attempt among some people on the left who try to appeal to right wingers by like reinforcing their stuff, like their bullshit, by saying stuff like, "Oh yeah, COVID, like the lockdown's a conspiracy to control the working class."
Yeah,
It's like
it's fucking tailism.
or that. Yeah, or that, just bashing SJW libs all day. Like that's not the right wingers aren't going to just gravitate to the left because they see someone agreeing with their very simplistic points. So I think you need to like overtly change ideology. So you need to like build. You need to kind of go in with the intention. I think people need to go in the intention of persuading people. For some people, rational argumentation can work, but for others, I don't think people always change their mind in terms of that. There's all kind of what I call propaganda, and that was the old sense, is that all movements had propaganda. Lenin spoke a lot about propaganda. Kautsky speaks of propaganda in the social revolution. And it's necessary to kind of build a kind of consent for people, and you need to get simple messages in there. And sometimes the aesthetics matters, right? We can't just say the aesthetics is only a fascist thing. Right, there's this reaction. Sometimes people say, well, the fascists do aestheticization.
Yeah.
Well, the fascists don't do it because it's fascist. They do it because it works.
That's true.
You need sometimes simple ways. Like that's why, like let's say the Soviet Union had Soviet realist art. Now, should art be limited to realism? I don't think so. But I think that was a powerful form of propaganda. Gives people like a meta-narrative of like progression in society. You always need some propaganda. The left kind of, I think, heavily lacks that. I think nothing more than the example, in my opinion, of the Corbyn campaign failing miserably with propaganda is that it was just him like appealing to the NHS and saying, talking in moralistic terms. That's a big thing I always see with candidates, moralistic terms. And we've been doing that for ages. I just don't think that's enough. You really need to really persuade people in various different ways. I think, okay, there's many, it doesn't have to just be YouTube videos. It doesn't have to just be art, films. It can even be things like music or TikToks. Like I see people doing communist TikToks where, you see all those things where it's like, you get banana, I get bananas, you get military dictatorship. It's like talking about the American empire where it's like, I get oil, you get genocide. It's like those that stuff is funny. It gets like the message really quick. And some
Memes are
memes,
pretty
honestly,
effective.
like
Let's be honest. How many fucking communists do
that's
you
my
see?
next video.
The power
It's
of
about
memes.
memes. Yeah, well, it's
I'm looking
like the
forward to
right,
that.
I think, in many ways was effective in that. And there's some good left memes. Like I won't say like the left isn't good at
Oh yeah,
memeing all the time. And
communist memes are great.
the yeah, the problem is they just don't leave the left. They're sometimes just in Reddit. Like they're people. I think sometimes you'll have good luck, better luck at least, persuading some apolitical working class friends just by sending them a couple of like working class conscious relatable funny memes than you will trying to like lecture them on like Marxism or something like that. You know?
Necessity for the break with Second International Revisionism and why we needed the Leninist turn.
Exactly.
Wygotsky was wrong. Yeah. No, you are right. I mean, we're very detached in some ways. I mean, the kind of conversations that we have, like even the kinds of things like we're talking about like this evening, it's a hard sell for a lot of people to be like, hey, let's talk about accelerationism.
Yep.
Oh, even the terminology that we're using, like we talk about like productive forces, relation to production.
Oh, I would never use that term with like normies.
Like
ever.
we can't, because it's like, what the fuck does that even mean? Even if you break that down, productive forces, it's like, okay, it means production and labor power. Like what, means production and labor. Like even if you say means production, people are like, well, what's that? Like what does that actually? What's that comprised of? You know, and so like the jargon we use is so, I suppose, impenetrable for many people, and I think that memes are a way of kind of bridging that in many cases in a very simple and kind of fun way.
Well,
you know.
I've learned that also through making content is in my how billionaires save Democrats video. I kind of mentioned Marxism a little bit too soon. I mentioned it like in 5 minutes in. Granted, there were some libertarians who actually commented that, saying like, "Oh, very interesting take. I actually agree with some of the things." Like it was surprising. It had a decent reach, but I kind of noticed that there are also some people who clicked off a lot right when I mentioned Marx.
Yeah,
and but like what I did with the most recent video is that I kind of basically made Marxist type arguments, and then I didn't mention Marx until like the end. And then I kind of say, I debunked some things, right? Because like I thought it was funny to mention that Marx and Engels like were informally capitalists, in terms of like at least Engels owned a factory and Marx traded bonds and stocks occasionally. And the point I used to make that is that they criticize the capitalism from an economic, non-moral standpoint. It's not like moralistic, idealist arguments. Like they're saying like this is what it is. So I wanted to immediately get rid of the idea. There's some people who say, "Oh, you have a Patreon and you're a communist." What? You make money and you're a communist. What are you doing? It's
you
like,
exist.
Okay, what am I supposed
society?
to do? Just starve?
You exist within society, and yet you criticize society. Curious. It's like, come on, guys.
I honestly think if Marx was alive today, he'd be trading Bitcoin.
He'd be an Ethereum man.
Straight
to the moon.
Ethereum's more interesting.
Yeah, hodl. That's what they say. Hodl. Yeah, absolutely. Those are really, really interesting points. I got distracted now. I'm just thinking about Bitcoin.
But it's also like a really well. Actually, that's what I went on this podcast called the Blockchain Socialist recently, because he's a comrade who's trying to radicalize people in the crypto communities, because in the crypto communities there's a lot of people like who are kind of libertarians who actually hate banks and they hate a lot of the establishment, but they're just kind of lost. They think that Bitcoin will magically create like decentralization and create power, like take power away from the ruling class. And it's like, yeah, fucking right. But they're more, in my opinion, they're just more swayable. Like they're people, I've always found libertarians, I've had success swaying libertarians and liberals compared to people who are like hardcore religious conservatives are always very hard, for me at least. Maybe some people find it the opposite, but for me, libertarians are a lot easier to switch to Marxism when you kind of really clarify that Marx is like kind of essentially like the end goal of Marxism is to kind of dissolve the state, right? And it's for, to change the power of the people in the in charge, right? So it's, yeah, I feel like we should also have like groups of people in mind too. And when we're persuading, like I'll use different terminology with different people. It's always like having that, right? Like that's the difference between this idea of open discourse where everyone just says, like talks rational discourse. Like you need to persuade people. Like, come on, like the right persuade people. The right doesn't just share all their ideas. Like if the right was to be totally honest, they would say, well, we want to cut your wages. We want to privatize your healthcare. We want to go to wars and send your children to wars. It's like they don't do that. They kind of like, beat around the bush a little bit, then kind of get there after. Whereas I don't think we have to take the exact same approach, but I think what I mean is just like shifting rhetoric depending on who we're trying to persuade. Like that, to me, that's so important because I think at least for any like revolutionary possibilities in the Western world, we need to at least have like a democratic socialist can actually be electable. Not that I think that would bring forth socialism, because I'm also kind of like you, pretty skeptical of that, especially in the United States, which I don't view as a democracy whatsoever. But like we at least need the chance, because if people voted for Boris Johnson over Corbyn, I mean, this is no possibility right now. There needs to be a better effort of educating the working class. And I tend to find like the British left especially is heavily in its echo chamber all the time. Like they're at their Verso book meetings and like, just talking with other theory readers. It's like we need to be educating the working class because, okay, consider this. In America, this is not obviously different from Britain, but in America, the most socialist, the places where socialism was the most popular, where Eugene Debs had the biggest strongholds, were Oklahoma and Alabama, like two what are now like red states.
Yeah, that's
it's
very
really interesting.
Very interesting, yeah.
In Canada too, it was the prairies. Canada, it was a lot of like our rural areas, which were really popular in after World War I and after World War II. Whereas now it's the opposite. It's like rural people are more conservative.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you do get a lot of modern communists who kind of try to appeal to that kind of conservative communism, conservative socialism. Personally, I'm not into it. It doesn't do it for me. I think it's kind of a reactionary tailist kind of perspective to take. But there is something there. There is something there to be had. The most economically deprived people do need socialism and are often the most amenable to socialist and communist ideas. So, yeah. But anyway, that's not.
Well, there's a thin line between Irish. Well, there's a fine line between Irish republicanism and National Socialism, right?
Jesus Christ. Yeah, well, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, like, whenever I suppose that's a whole different thing. We could go on for like hours about nationalism, like left-wing nationalism and progressive patriotism versus like reactionary like nationalism and all these kinds of things, because
that's definitely a whole other topic.
Yeah, we could talk for hours.
Back when communism was popular in Canada, it was actually kind of nationalistic, not in a racial sense, but it was very anti-American and anti-British. Like that's how our communist movement was under Tommy Douglas, who was kind of like, I guess you could say, a person who started off as a communist became like a democratic socialist. But back, I guess you could say, when Canada had its strongest socialist movement, it actually kind of had a nationalist taint. It was like very pro-Canada, anti-US, anti-Britain. And I mean, like, I'm not a fan of like, ethno-nationalism.
Yeah.
But I can see like nationalism sometimes is just a strategy, right?
It's a start. Like that's kind of the point. Like it's like the devil's in the dose when it comes to nationalism. Like a tiny little bit of nationalism to awaken a political consciousness can be pretty good, but when people take a little bit too much of it, then it becomes a poison very, very quickly. What was once a medicine becomes a poison very quickly, and then you can get into some serious ethno-nationalist stuff, which can be very, very harmful. And you get into the supremacist kind of chauvinist stuff, and you need to be very, very careful when it comes to that. But when it comes to this kind of idea of like ethno-nationalism and stuff like that, people will say like, oh, well, civic nationalism's okay, ethno-nationalism's bad. And I don't know, sometimes I feel like I need to push back on that as well, because this idea of like ethno-nationalism, it's like, well, what is black nationalism? Like what? Like how is that civic nationalist or is that ethno nationalist? Like where does that fit into the argument? It seems like the argument against ethno nationalism is coming from this kind of imperialist nationalist kind of sentiments, where it
Hmm.
assumes that we're talking about white nationalism and white supremacy rather than like the reverse of that. You know, it's kind of it's equating the I think it's falsely making a false equivalence between the oppressors and the oppressed, because I think upholding the nationalisms of the oppressed can be progressive to a certain extent, as long as it doesn't go too far. But the nationalism of the oppressors is never, ever, ever going to be a progressive development. You know,
That's like exactly Frantz Fanon's point, I believe, is
yeah,
that
yeah, yeah, yeah.
he analyzed, when he analyzed Algeria, he was pretty critical of the Algerian resistance, and that it didn't really have a socialist base,
Mm,
but it was very nationalist. And he thought like nationalism can only be a thing for the oppressed classes,
mm, mm. Yeah,
and
definitely.
yeah,
Yeah. But even then, you need to be kind of careful with it, because that's like one of the things we know, like with Irish nationalism, and because Irish republicanism does kind of rely on some kind of national consciousness, the idea that there is like an Irish nation which is separate to like the Brits and the English and the people who oppressed us for so long, and like literally just destroyed our language. The reason why I'm speaking English right now, so there is this idea
hmm
that there is like an Irish nation there somehow, and that our culture has kind of been erased, and there's kind of a sense of, well, we kind of want to just exist. That's kind of it. We don't want to be better or worse than anyone else. We just want to be left to kind of do our own thing. And I suppose you're kind of getting
I'm
into idealist territory when we start getting into that kind of stuff. But there
true.
is something there, and whether or not you want to call that like ethnic nationalism, or if you want to call it like civic nationalism, I don't know. It's a nationalism of the oppressed anyway, and I think that's a really important distinction. But that being said, even going back to like 1867, the Republican movement, the Irish Fenian Proclamation of 1867, was very clear that we this was an anti-capitalist movement that stood in solidarity with the workers of the world. It literally appealed to the workers of England. It literally said that our enemy is the aristocrats, the capitalists, the people who steal from our land, um, either of the land of the UK, of Britain, and or the land of Ireland, actually, which was part of the UK at that time. But the point was, they were saying that the enemy isn't the workers of this country. The enemy isn't the normal working class people, the oppressed masses. The enemy is the capitalists. The enemy is the aristocrats. And they specifically say whether that aristocrat is English or Irish doesn't matter. It's the aristocrat that's the problem. And so even going back to like
Mm.
to 1867, they already had that more developed political consciousness within the Irish Republican movement. It had moved beyond a narrow nationalism and towards a much more emancipatory struggle, which addressed both the social and the national question rather than just the national question.
Yeah.
Which I think is really, really important. Because that national consciousness is important, because this idea of like Brits out is really prominent in Ireland, and it's like, yes, Brits out, but when we say Brits out, we mean the British state. We want the British state
Right.
out of
Yeah.
Ireland, not the British
Exactly.
working class. We don't care. They're fine. The working class of all nations unite. That's fine. It's the aristocrats, it's the
Yeah.
capitalists. They're the ones
That's
to
how
fight
I see it
against.
too. Is nationalism can be a strategy, but without a class analysis,
Hmm.
it's very dangerous. Um, like yeah, when it's overly racial, but at heart,
Yeah.
okay. I mean, I've advocated that in Canada, like any left movement should adopt a kind of nationalist approach, because we've been kind of screwed by American free trade a lot.
Hmm.
And vaccines, we can't even produce our own vaccines because of a free trade deal we did in the 1980s. It's total bullshit. We depend on America for vaccines, and we've dealt with the virus terribly. But at heart, I'm probably the furthest end of the spectrum, opposite to nationalist, in the sense that I'm actually like
Good.
anti-identity entirely. Like in the sense that I don't know. I'm like, it's probably, well, it's because I'm multi-ethnic. I'm a mixture of
Hmm.
different races, and I grew up in Canada in a pretty cosmopolitan area. So it's probably that, but also I just genuinely, I'm anti-identity in general, and this is, I guess, I have a kind of this is where my Deleuzian influences kick in. I'm actually I think identity is synonymous with the ego, and it's a core of a lot of conflicts, petty conflicts primarily. And yeah, I in general try to avoid any like, I wish to see a politics that does not rally on identity. Let's just say that. Like, I'm not, I guess, a collectivist or whatever.
You know, it's kind of what we said earlier on. Like there can be like a mobilizing element to these identity struggles. A lot of people get politicized through identity struggles, whether that's a national liberation struggle
Yeah,
or
of course. And oppressed people,
unoppressed
I
people.
totally sympathize with that.
Yeah, definitely. Or whether it's like they get into politics through feminism or through LGBTQ plus liberation struggle, or you know, all these sorts of things. You know, so people, it can be a mobilizing force, but I think it's always important that we go beyond that and use that to sort of springboard into a truly emancipatory politic, which unfortunately a lot of those aren't, because a lot of those struggles are very much seeking reforms within the capitalist system. You know, a little tweak here and there to make things, you know, to allow for more, I don't know, white female CEOs or something like that. You know, which
Oh yeah,
it's not
I
emancipation.
love making fun of that all the time.
It's not emancipation for the majority of women. Then it's just liberalism. You know, so
Yeah, 100%.
yeah, absolutely. Okay, so listen, this has been absolutely brilliant. There was one question here from, I can't pronounce the name, Adiraj Nayar. I hope I'm pronounced that correctly. I'm so sorry if I butchered that. Comrade asks, ask One Dime to do a shout out of his favorite YouTube channels, Paul. So One Dime, could you please do some shout out some YouTube channels that you really like, that you get a lot from? Maybe some sort of up and coming or lesser known YouTube channels might be a nice time
Sure.
to kind of boost them now.
Paul Morin, and
That's very nice.
okay.
He sounds like a dick though.
Okay, I will say off the bat, Artin Salimi. So if you want like literal philosophy, kind of left-wing theory rap, Artin Salimi is like a legitimate rapper, and he's actually good at rapping and makes good instrumentals. And he raps about songs like he did, you know, Space Babies, of course. Right? I was gonna say that's the next one. Space Babies is so underrated. Like, I don't know how he doesn't get more views. Like, this guy is like
wild.
Great. But I was about to mention, Artin actually did a collab with Space Babies, where Artin played the role of Karl Kautsky, and Space Babies played the role of Lenin, and they rapped back and forth. I think you've seen it, right? Like, that was so sick.
Yeah.
Artin is definitely underrated. I really like I like him. Other small channels. Okay.
Shout out to Vuchko. Chat there. Vuchko is a good channel as well.
I don't watch a lot of YouTube, to be frank. Like, I mean, I watch a very small, specific few channels. There's definitely some I'm just probably forgetting entirely. Okay.
Space Babies.
Yeah,
support as well.
Space Babies and Artin are really good. Oh, A New Conversation. I'll say that he doesn't really make videos. He does like podcasts, but A New Conversation is like, I've had him on my like exclusive Patreon podcast. He's also like, he's an Irish communist as well. Very smart guy.
Who? Sorry, what's the name?
A New Conversation.
A New Conversation.
Yeah, I've had him on my exclusives before. I have him in my dope channel selection. And one more, I'll say the Acid Left, which is the Acid Left is run by Mike Watson, who's like a Zero Books author and like professor. And he runs it with another guy called Adam, who does like the visuals. And they do like really nice aesthetics. Like they do like, left-wing stuff pretty much, more on the theoretical end. Like critical theory end, but and they do so with like very like psychedelic aesthetics. I like their content.
Fantastic. I'll check them out. Yeah, I've got this open now.
I also like Plastic Pills. I wouldn't say he's a really small channel now. But I definitely like Plastic Pills. Ugopnik, but he's not really a small channel anymore. I don't watch those, like the YouTubers I watch, to be honest. Like I watch Ugopnik, Space Babies, Pills. I watch Cuck Philosophy, but he never uploads. There's just not a lot of YouTubers I watch, to be frank.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just gonna link that a new conversation. Shout out to another Irish comrade. There aren't that many of us, so just
A
share
shout
the link
out.
there.
She should make more videos. A World to Win should make more videos.
Yeah, she's great. She's
Um,
great.
yeah,
Very smart comrade.
yeah, absolutely.
Mm. Okay,
And
brilliant.
spooky, scary socialist, but he's not a small channel.
Amazing
This
channel.
guy's animating is insane.
It's wild.
I animate a lot in my videos, and like for like as I know behind the scenes, like
Takes
how
so long.
it takes so long. So I can appreciate how like good his animating is.
But it's why, you know, he uploads like maybe like 2 or 3 times a year. So like you can see the work. Like the videos he puts out take months to produce. You know, they take a really, really long time. And you can see like each animation, each frame of his work, you know. It's really impressive. It's gonna take a really, really long time to draw all that out, and yeah, I don't know I don't know how he has the patience.
Yeah, it's
for it, but,
insane.
yeah, and I think he's in school as well. I think he's working hard at that. So big
Oh
respect,
wow.
big respect to this comrade for finding time to help educate us all and debunk the myths against socialism historically. Okay, brilliant. Listen, I really, really appreciate you coming on. This has been fantastic. Just before we wrap things up fully, did you want to shout out anyone or anything before we wrap things up? Did you want to maybe tell people about your upcoming work? I know we've kind of touched on this a little bit before, but maybe just if there's any final words before we fully close this off.
Yeah. So yeah. How do I say this? I don't want to gas myself up too much, but I think I make pretty dank videos. Like
You do.
I put a lot of I put a lot into the editing, like to make it like a visual experience. So I try to do it so it's just not like a typical like I don't know analysis of some Netflix show where I'm like standing there talking. Like I really like try to put like effort and like stuff people can also like share with their friends and family because that's important. Is like I think if like someone gets if you get like radicalized from certain channels, I feel it's really good to share that with other people you think could benefit.
Yeah, definitely.
I would recommend though how Democrats save billionaires, the socialism of Warren Buffett. Obviously I don't say he's a socialist, that's just a clickbait title, but but like I kind of show how his like admission and how I explain how the stock market works and how like by his own admission like he makes a case for going beyond capitalism. And I would also say the Baudrillard Call of Duty simulations of war, which is kind of like I parallel the Gulf War and I parallel so how Call of Duty portrays a Gulf War, how the media portrays a Gulf War, and how they're actually equally as inaccurate. And how they're like the point is that you know okay, like Call of Duty is like an obvious simulation of war, but that can also distract us from like the fact that so is the media. The media is also kind of a simulacrum of war in many ways. So yeah, and then my upcoming video is about memes as ideological warfare, how memes act as agents. Then after that, I have one on acid communism, like Mark Fisher's idea of acid communism, which is not really a system or ideology. It's just kind of like he thinks like the aesthetic of the hippie movement was good, but like the movement itself was horse shit. So he thinks that like that he kind of sees like we need like communism, but with like different aesthetics, if that makes sense. But I kind of talk about that. And then I have one about I don't want to say too much about it, but it's like a documentary, and it's called The Burnout Society, and it's about a form of ideology called psychopolitics, and how kind of people become masters of their own exploitation. They kind of become both their masters and their own slaves, not in a literal sense, but you know, in the gig economy sense of their own labor, and how this new ideology of what I use as hustle culture or like self-help culture is like the very especially different form of capitalist ideology that gets people to actively not just like be blind to their exploitation, to like enjoy it. And that one's so that's what I got going on.
That's so depressing, and I know it's going to be fantastic and enlightening and insightful, but Jesus Christ, is that depressing.
Yeah, I'm kind of numb to it all at this point.
Yep. life under capitalism. Okay, listen, this has been great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on, taking the time out to talk about all this stuff. I think it's been very enlightening and educational for all of us, myself included, and I really appreciate the perspectives that you brought to this conversation. So thank you very much for that. One time, this has been great. Thank you so much to all the comrades in the chat who've checked this out. I see Wending Win, Fujiko, Matthew Calise, Bubble Boy, DM Nagano, Matthew Calise, Pepe Chulo. Who else can I see there? Spooky Scary Socialist, a new conversation. Stay frosty. Sick. Yeah, we got a lot of good people here. Adaraj Nair, pronouncing your name incorrectly again, I'm sure. Revolution International. Guys, thanks so much for being here. Hope you've enjoyed this. Have a great weekend, and back next week. Cheers, everybody. August Longfo.
Peace.